The first shots were fired by aircraft that never saw the ships they were killing. In May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy pushed south with a clear operational objective: seize Port Moresby and fracture the sea link between the United States and Australia. On a map, it looked clinical: arrows descending through the Coral Sea, carrier groups screening invasion convoys, fuel consumption calculated in thousands of gallons per hour. But beneath that clean geometry sat arithmetic that would not bend. Japan committed fleet carriers displacing over 20,000 tons each, protected by cruisers mounting guns that fired shells weighing over 100 pounds. Transports carried troops and equipment measured in the thousands of men and hundreds of tons. If those transports reached their objective intact, the Allied defensive perimeter in the South Pacific would erode. The problem was distance. The Coral Sea stretched across hundreds of miles of open water. Carrier warfare required reconnaissance arcs extending beyond visual horizon. A scout plane that misjudged coordinates by even 20 miles could send an entire strike package into empty ocean, burning hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel per aircraft for nothing. Japanese planning assumed detection advantage and coordinated strike timing, but fog, cloud cover, and imperfect intelligence fractured synchronization. Across that same ocean, the United States Navy assembled a counterforce built around carriers such as USS Lexington and USS Yorktown, each over 800 feet long, each carrying roughly 70 aircraft. Their decks were not plated with 12-inch armor like battleships. They relied on distance, air power, and maneuver. Aviation fuel tanks below deck stored tens of thousands of gallons of highly volatile gasoline. A single bomb penetrating into hangar space could ignite catastrophic chain reactions. The battle did not begin with ships colliding in gun range. It began with search patterns. On May 7th, American aircraft located and attacked what they believed was a primary Japanese carrier force. Instead, they found and sank the light carrier Shōhō, a vessel displacing over 11,000 tons. Bombs weighing 1,000 pounds punched through its deck. Torpedoes carrying hundreds of pounds of explosive fractured hull plating. Within hours, that carrier slid beneath the surface. Japan lost not only steel, but trained aviators whose replacement required months of instruction. Inside a dive bomber, descending toward Shōhō, a pilot felt the airframe shudder as flak burst nearby. Sweat gathered beneath goggles. Release altitude narrowed to seconds. When the bomb detached, the aircraft jerked upward violently. Below, a plume of fire erupted. The tactical success was immediate. The strategic effect accumulated. The following day, both fleets misidentified targets and launched strikes based on incomplete reconnaissance. Japanese aircraft located USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. Bombs struck decks. Torpedoes slammed into hulls. Lexington absorbed multiple hits. Firefighting teams pumped seawater measured in thousands of gallons per minute through hoses. Damage control officers recalibrated counterflooding to stabilize list angles. For several hours, it appeared the ship might survive. Then, aviation fuel vapors ignited internally. Secondary explosions ripped through compartments. Steel bulkheads buckled. The carrier, displacing over 30,000 tons, became unsalvageable. American destroyers scuttled her to prevent capture. That loss was not symbolic. It removed roughly 70 aircraft capacity from the Pacific Theater in a single afternoon. So why did Japan lose? Because strategic objectives stalled. The invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby required air cover to approach safely. With Shōhō sunk, Shōkaku damaged, and Zuikaku's air group suffering heavy losses, in some squadrons exceeding 50% casualties, Japanese carrier strength fractured at the exact moment sustained protection was required. A carrier's hull can be repaired in dockyards measured in weeks or months. A trained pilot corps erodes in hours. When I sat comparing pre-battle Japanese air group rosters with post-engagement strength returns, what struck me was not simply aircraft destroyed, but pilot attrition. Japan's naval aviator training pipeline required extended flight hours, advanced carrier landing practice, and combat seasoning. Replacing dozens of experienced aircrew could not be accelerated overnight. The United States, by contrast, expanded pilot training programs across multiple states, graduating increasing numbers as the war progressed. Industrial arithmetic favored one side. Operational tempo also fractured Japanese coordination. Misidentification of oilers as carriers, delayed reconnaissance reports, and staggered strike arrivals prevented concentrated knockout blows. Fuel reserves aboard carriers, measured in tens of thousands of gallons, constrained search radius and pursuit capability. Every sortie consumed finite reserves. When fleets maneuvered without decisive contact, endurance declined. Strategically, Port Moresby remained unconquered. The amphibious force withdrew. The sea lane between America and Australia did not fracture. That outcome alone constitutes Japanese failure. Tactical exchanges were costly on both sides, but strategic intent stalled. There is another layer. 1 month later, at Midway, Japan entered battle without Shōkaku and with Zuikaku's air group depleted. Coral Sea did not annihilate Japan's carrier force. It eroded it just enough. Attrition accumulates before catastrophe announces itself. Imagine standing on the deck of a carrier at dawn, engines rumbling beneath your boots, the deck vibrating as aircraft launch one after another. You do not see the enemy fleet. You trust coordinates scribbled in grease pencil. You trust that your strike group will collide with steel rather than horizon. Hours later, smoke columns rise, but you do not know if they mark victory or miscalculation. The Coral Sea demonstrated that carriers, not battleships with armor measured in inches thick, dictated naval reach. It also demonstrated that aircraft losses could cripple operational plans, even when hull losses appeared balanced. Japan inflicted damage. Japan sank a fleet carrier, but Japan failed to secure its objective. The invasion stalled. Pilot losses accumulated. Replacement rates lagged. If you are listening now, maybe lying back as the day thins into quiet, picture two fleets separated by more than 100 miles of ocean, each launching aircraft into gray sky. No admiral sees the opposing flagship, only radar plots, radio calls, and the distant tremor of explosions. The sea absorbs wreckage without commentary. Gradually, one side turns back, objective incomplete. This is the entire history of why Japan lost the Battle of the Coral Sea. Chapter 1. The Carbon Copy That Killed a Fleet. Sometime in the third week of April, 1942, in a windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a yeoman, rank unknown, name unrecorded, sat hunched over a mimeograph machine and pulled a carbon copy decrypt sheet from the roller. The air in that basement was thick, stale, recycled through a ventilation system that hadn't been designed for the 30-odd men who now lived there around the clock. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and old coffee, and the particular chemical tang of mimeograph ink. On the sheet was a partial decrypt of an intercepted Japanese naval transmission. 5-digit code groups, some resolved into kana syllables, most still opaque. One group had been resolved to a 2-letter geographic designator, M-O, and next to it, in pencil, someone had drawn a small, careful question mark. That question mark, hesitant, conditional, the graphite equivalent of a shrug, may be the most consequential piece of punctuation in the Pacific War up to that date. It meant, we think this means Port Moresby. We think the Japanese are going there. We are not certain. And from that uncertainty, from that smudged carbon copy in a room that smelled like exhaustion, the entire Allied response to Operation MO would unspool. 2 fleet carriers, thousands of men, and a battle that would bend the trajectory of the war in the Pacific before most of the men fighting it understood what they were fighting for. The decrypt sheet belonged to Station Hypo, the Navy's combat intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, commanded by a man named Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was a lieutenant commander, a cryptanalyst by training and temperament, and by April of 1942, he had been working on the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, designated JN-25B by the Americans, for months without adequate sleep, adequate staff, or adequate certainty about anything. JN-25B was not a simple substitution cipher. It was a super-enciphered code. Japanese words and phrases were first converted into 5-digit numerical groups, using a codebook containing roughly 33,333 entries. And then, each of those groups was further disguised by the addition, modular 10, no carrying, of another 5-digit group drawn from a separate additive book. To strip the additive and reach the base code, Rochefort's analysts needed to find depths, instances where 2 or more intercepted messages happened to use the same starting point in the additive book. Finding a depth was probabilistic, exploiting it was grueling, and the results were fragmentary. By late April, Hypo had recovered reliable values for roughly 3,800 of those 33,000 code groups, approximately 11.4% of the system. The entire Allied strategic decision to commit 2 irreplaceable fleet carriers to the Coral Sea would rest on slightly more than 1/10 of an enemy cryptographic system being readable. That isn't omniscience. That's a wager. And it was a wager being placed against competing advice. Because Rochefort's basement wasn't the only signals intelligence shop working JN-25B. In Washington, the Navy's OP-20G section, led by Commander John Redman, was reading the same raw intercepts and reaching a different conclusion. Where Rochefort saw MO and interpreted Port Moresby, where he saw unit reassignments and carrier movements suggesting an imminent southward thrust. Redman's team believed the main Japanese effort would come in the Central Pacific. The MO traffic, in Washington's reading, was either secondary or possibly deceptive, a feint designed to draw American forces south, while the real blow fell elsewhere. The disagreement wasn't subtle, it was fundamental. 2 groups of intelligent, dedicated analysts, working from identical raw material, produced opposing strategic assessments. This is something the popular mythology of code-breaking rarely acknowledges. Signals intelligence is not a window, it is an argument. The intercepts don't speak for themselves. They are interpreted by exhausted humans who bring assumptions, institutional biases, and incomplete information to every decrypt worksheet. And in April 1942, the argument between Pearl Harbor and Washington was unresolved. Someone had to choose which argument to believe. That someone was Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz chose Rochefort. The reasons were partly analytical. Rochefort's team had been right more often than Washington's in recent months, and partly personal. Nimitz trusted Rochefort. He had met the man, visited the basement, seen the work. Trust, in this context, wasn't sentiment. It was an operational input. Nimitz weighed 2 competing intelligence assessments, neither of which could be verified without committing forces, and he sided with the one produced by the team he'd personally evaluated. On or around the 22nd of April 1942, Nimitz ordered Task Force 17, built around the carrier Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and Task Force 11, built around the carrier Lexington under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, to proceed to the Coral Sea and oppose whatever the Japanese were planning. The order went out from SINCPAC headquarters. It was based on a partial decrypt, a question mark in pencil, and one admiral's judgment about which group of cryptanalysts to believe. The carriers turned south. What Rochefort's team had partially pieced together, and what Japanese records, examined after the war, would confirm, was Operation MO, a complex, multi-pronged offensive designed to seize Port Moresby on the southeastern coast of New Guinea and establish a seaplane base at Tulagi in the southern Solomons. Port Moresby was the prize. It was the last significant Allied base on New Guinea's southern coast, and its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, threaten Australia's northern approaches, and sever the air route between Australia and the Philippines. The operation was planned by the staff of the Japanese 4th Fleet, headquartered at Rabaul, under Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue. It involved a carrier striking force, the fleet carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku of Carrier Division 5, under the tactical command of Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, a covering group built around the light carrier Shōhō, an invasion convoy of 11 transports carrying roughly 5,500 troops of the South Seas Detachment, and land-based air assets from Rabaul. 5 prongs, converging timelines, an assumption of surprise. The plan was, on paper, orthodox Japanese combined operations doctrine. In practice, it was a machine with no tolerance for the unexpected, and the unexpected was already sailing toward it. When I was cross-referencing the hypo-decrypt records with the combined fleet operational summaries compiled in the Senshi Sosho, Japan's official multi-volume operational history, assembled after the war from surviving documents and officer interrogations, what struck me most wasn't the intelligence breakthrough itself, but the fragility of the chain that connected it to action. Rochefort's team didn't produce a clean, confident report that said, the Japanese will invade Port Moresby on the 10th of May, with 2 carriers and 11 transports. They produced fragments, partial decrypts, educated guesses about place name designators. And these fragments were contested by a rival intelligence shop in Washington that had institutional reasons, bureaucratic turf, proximity to the Navy's senior leadership, to insist on its own interpretation. The distance between a fragment of decoded kana and 2 fleet carriers changing course is enormous, and it was bridged not by technology or certainty, but by human judgment under pressure. Nimitz made a decision. He could have been wrong. Redmond could have been right. The Central Pacific could have been the real target. The entire Coral Sea deployment could have been a misallocation of forces at a moment when the Navy couldn't afford to misallocate anything. I think we need to sit with that uncertainty for a moment, because the retrospective clarity of knowing how it turned out, knowing that Rochefort was right, obscures the terror of the moment when nobody knew. The men who produced these fragments were, by any reasonable human standard, operating beyond the limits of sustainable function. Rochefort's unit worked in what they called the dungeon. No windows, artificial light at all hours, a space that erased the boundary between day and night. Rochefort himself was famous for working in a bathrobe and slippers, not out of eccentricity, but out of the practical realization that there was no point changing into a uniform when you weren't going to leave the building. His analysts worked in shifts that bled into one another, 4 hours of sleep if they were lucky, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that the fleet was counting on their output. At least 2 members of the unit were hospitalized for exhaustion before the battle even began. The decrypt worksheets they produced, the carbon copies with their penciled question marks and tentative kana resolutions, were the output of minds running on fumes. And those outputs were, in the aggregate, more right than wrong, but not entirely right, and never certain. That distinction, between right and certain, is the one that matters most, and it's the one that popular accounts of code-breaking most consistently erase. The Japanese, meanwhile, operated under the assumption that their communications were secure. The JN-25B code had been in service since December of 1940, and while the Japanese Navy periodically changed the additive books, forcing the Allies to rebuild their recoveries from scratch, they did not, in early 1942, believe the code itself was fundamentally compromised. They were, in a strict sense, correct. The code wasn't fully broken. 11% readability is not broken, but 11% was enough to reveal patterns, unit designators, geographic references, date-time groups, that, in the hands of analysts who had been immersed in Japanese naval communications for years, yielded actionable intelligence. The Japanese failure wasn't in their cryptographic design, which was sound. It was in their assumption about the threshold of readability that constituted danger. They assumed the enemy needed to read their messages fully to act on them. They were wrong. Partial knowledge, filtered through expert interpretation, was sufficient. And so, by the last week of April 1942, the pieces were in motion. 2 American carrier task forces were heading south, guided by incomplete intelligence and an admiral's trust in a cryptanalyst. A Japanese multi-pronged offensive was heading south, guided by a rigid timetable and an assumption of surprise that was already false. The collision would produce the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval history, an engagement fought entirely by aircraft, where the opposing surface fleets never came within sight of each other. Neither side fully understood what it was getting into. Carrier warfare was, in the spring of 1942, an almost entirely theoretical form of combat. The textbooks said one thing, the war games had suggested another, and the reality, when it came, would confound both. But all of that was still days away. For now, the relevant fact is the carbon copy, the question mark, and the wager. Everything else, the torpedoes, the fires, the sinking ships and drowning men, flows downstream from a pencil mark on a mimeograph sheet in a room that smelled like old coffee and no sleep. The ventilation fan in the dungeon hummed. The decrypt sheets accumulated. Somewhere in the Coral Sea, the water was the particular shade of deep blue that comes with 1,000 fathoms of depth beneath a tropical sky. And neither the men in the basement nor the men on the carriers knew, with anything approaching certainty, what was coming. The question mark, in pencil, remained. Chapter 2. 11 Knots and the Weight of Empire. The harbor at Rabaul sits inside a volcanic caldera on the northeastern tip of New Britain, and in early May of 1942, it was full of ships. Not warships, or not primarily warships. Transports. 11 of them, riding low in the water with the particular heaviness of vessels loaded to their marks, their holds full of equipment, ammunition, and roughly 5,500 troops of the South Seas Detachment, Imperial Japanese Army. The air over the harbor was the wet, clinging heat of the equatorial Pacific, temperatures in the low 30s Celsius, humidity that made metal slick and paper limp. Aboard those transports, soldiers waited. They had been briefed on their objective. the seizure of Port Moresby, on the far side of New Guinea, roughly 500 nautical miles to the south-southeast across the Solomon Sea and around the Papuan Peninsula. Their departure date was the 4th of May. Their landing date was the 10th. Between those two dates, 6 days of transit, the convoy would need to cross open water at a pace dictated by the slowest ships in the formation. Not one of those 11 transports could sustain more than 12 knots. Most were rated for 11, and 11 knots, roughly 20 kilometers per hour, roughly the speed of a man jogging, was the tempo that would govern everything. Every air search, every carrier maneuver, every tactical decision in the coming battle would be shaped, constrained, and ultimately broken by the fact that the ships carrying the whole point of the operation could move no faster than a man could run. This is the kind of detail that military histories tend to bury in appendices, if they mention it at all. The glamour of carrier warfare, the dive bombers, the torpedo runs, the flight decks wreathed in smoke, pulls the narrative toward the combatants and away from the lumbering, unglamorous vessels that were the reason the combatants were there in the first place. But Operation MO didn't exist to fight a carrier battle. It existed to put soldiers ashore at Port Moresby. The carriers were the shield, the transports were the sword, and the sword moved at 11 knots. When I first worked through the operational timeline laid out in Volume 49 of the Senshi Sosho, Japan's exhaustive, multi-volume official war history, compiled from surviving staff documents and post-war officer interrogations, what stopped me wasn't the carrier dispositions or the air orders of battle. It was a table. A simple table listing the 11 transports of the MO invasion force, their tonnages, and their maximum sustained speeds. The table is dry, factual, unremarkable in isolation. But when you lay it against the operational timetable, departure May 4th, landing May 10th, zero margin for delay, you begin to see the architecture of a disaster. The plan required 72 hours of uncontested transit across open water. 72 hours during which the transports couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't defend themselves beyond the escort of 5 destroyers and a cruiser screen. 72 hours is an eternity when the enemy knows you're coming. The plan itself, Operation MO, as designated by the combined fleet, was a 5-pronged convergence. Each element had a name, a commander, a route, and a timetable, and all 5 were supposed to arrive at roughly the right place, at roughly the right time, to achieve concentration of force at the decisive moment. The carrier striking force, Shōkaku and Zuikaku under Vice Admiral Takagi, would sweep into the Coral Sea from the east, having looped around the Solomon Islands, and neutralize any Allied naval opposition. The covering group, built around the light carrier Shōhō under Rear Admiral Goto Aritomo, would provide close air cover for the invasion convoy as it transited. A separate force would seize Tulagi in the southern Solomons to establish a seaplane base. Land-based aircraft from the 25th Air Flotilla at Rabaul would conduct reconnaissance and suppression strikes on Allied airfields. And the invasion convoy itself, Rear Admiral Koso Abe's 11 transports, would deliver the South Seas detachment to Port Moresby's doorstep. 5 prongs, converging timelines. The doctrine behind this was Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle concept that the Imperial Japanese Navy had been refining since before the First World War. Multiple forces, operating on separate axes, converge at the critical point to overwhelm the enemy before he can concentrate his own forces. It was elegant. It had worked at Pearl Harbor, at the Java Sea, across the sweep of the opening offensive. It assumed one thing above all others, that the enemy would be reacting, not anticipating. The problem was that the enemy wasn't reacting. Thanks to the partial decrypts from Station Hypo, the 11% readability of JN-25B, discussed in the preceding chapter, Admiral Nimitz had a rough outline of Operation MO's shape, timing, and objective. Not a perfect outline, but enough to position his carriers in the Coral Sea before the Japanese arrived. This single fact, that the Allies were already in position, rather than scrambling to respond, inverted the entire logic of the convergent plan. When the enemy is reacting, convergent timelines are a strength, because each prong can fix the enemy's attention, while the others close in. When the enemy is already positioned, convergent timelines become a weakness, because each prong can be engaged in sequence before concentration is achieved. The transports, at 11 knots, could not accelerate out of danger. The carriers, committed to a wide approach route, could not close the gap quickly enough to provide real-time protection. The covering group, with its single light carrier, was powerful enough to shield the convoy against land-based air, but hopelessly outmatched against fleet carriers. The plan's elegance depended on surprise, and surprise was already gone. Vice Admiral Takagi's carrier striking force, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, with their combined air group of approximately 126 aircraft, was required to enter the Coral Sea from the east, having swung wide around the southern tip of the Solomon Chain. This approach route added roughly 600 nautical miles to their transit, compared to a direct route from Truk. 600 nautical miles is not a trivial detour for a carrier force. At a cruising speed of 18 knots, it represents an additional 33 hours of steaming, 33 hours of fuel consumption. The destroyers escorting Takagi's carriers burned fuel at a rate that gave them, at best, 5 to 6 days of high-speed operations before they needed to refuel from a fleet oiler. Every extra mile of transit was a mile subtracted from the fuel available for combat maneuvering, high-speed evasion, and the sustained operations that a carrier battle demanded. Takagi's approach was conservative, designed to avoid detection by Allied coast watchers in the Solomons, and to enter the battle area from an unexpected quarter. It was a surface officer's approach, shaped by the instinct to preserve the force rather than to seize the initiative, and it left him fuel-constrained before the fighting even began. It fascinates me how rarely the fuel arithmetic of Operation MO appears in the popular narratives. We remember the dive bombers. We remember Scratch 1 flat top. We remember the Lexington burning. But we don't remember that the entire operation was running on a fuel budget so tight that a single miscalculation, a single day's delay, a single unexpected high-speed run, could strand a destroyer escort without enough fuel to return to base. This wasn't unique to the Japanese. Fletcher, as we'll see, was equally obsessed with fuel states, equally constrained by the tyranny of the oiler schedule. But the Japanese had an additional burden. Their plan required 5 separate forces to reach 5 separate positions on 5 separate timelines, and the fuel budget for each force assumed no deviations. The transports couldn't go faster. The carriers couldn't take a shorter route. The covering group couldn't range far from the convoy. Every element was locked into its schedule by the physics of fuel consumption and the limitations of the ship's engineering plants. What looked like a coordinated offensive was, in reality, a set of parallel rail lines, each force running on its own track, unable to adapt to what the others were encountering, unable to converge ahead of schedule or delay without cascading consequences. When I look at the MO plan now, with the benefit of 84 years of hindsight, what I see isn't boldness, it's brittleness. The troops aboard those transports, the South Seas Detachment, drawn primarily from the 144th Infantry Regiment, knew none of this. They knew they were going to take Port Moresby. They had been told the operation would be supported by carriers and land-based air. They had been told to expect moderate Allied resistance, garrison troops, some Australian units, perhaps some air attacks. They had not been told that their convoy's schedule assumed no delays, because no one tells soldiers that the plan has no margin for error. The embarkation records, as reconstructed in the Sinking of Shōhō, list the equipment loaded: field artillery, ammunition, communications equipment, rations for the initial consolidation phase, vehicles. The weight of a seaborne invasion, measured in tons. The transport's holds were full, their decks were crowded, and their engines, turning over at 11 knots, would push them south through the Solomon Sea at a pace that turned every hour of transit into a measured, countable, agonizing unit of vulnerability. There is a detail from the Sinking of Shōhō that deserves attention, not for its operational significance, but for what it reveals about the assumptions underlying the plan. The Port Moresby landing had already been postponed once. Originally scheduled for March of 1942, it was delayed after the Leh-Salamaua raids of March 10th, in which carrier aircraft from Lexington and Yorktown struck Japanese positions on the northern New Guinea coast by flying over the Owen Stanley Range. The raids were a shock, not because they inflicted decisive damage, but because they demonstrated that Allied carriers could reach these waters, could strike Japanese positions in the Bismarck-Solomon area, and could withdraw before a response was organized. The Japanese knew, after March 10th, that the Coral Sea was within range of American carrier operations. They knew the enemy had the reach and the willingness to operate there, and yet the MO plan, finalized weeks later, assumed that the enemy would not be present in force when the invasion convoy transited. The assumption of surprise contradicted their own recent operational experience. This is not an observation I've seen emphasized in the standard literature, and to me, it is one of the most telling aspects of the plan's genesis. The evidence that the assumption was false was sitting in their own after-action reports. They didn't ignore it, exactly. They simply planned as if it weren't there. The convoy was scheduled to depart Rabaul on the 4th of May, 1942. The landing was scheduled for the 10th. Between those dates, 72 hours of transit across open water at 11 knots, with 5 destroyers and a light carrier for protection, against an enemy who already knew they were coming. The combined displacement of those 11 transports was approximately 72,000 gross register tons. They carried the soldiers, the equipment, the ammunition, and the entire purpose of Operation MO. Everything else, the fleet carriers, the air battles, the intelligence war, existed in service of getting those 72,000 tons to the beaches south of Port Moresby. And those 72,000 tons couldn't move faster than a man could jog. That's the constraint. That's the clock. And the clock was already running when the first transport raised anchor in Rabaul's Caldera Harbor, under a sky that promised heat and the particular oppressive stillness that precedes the monsoon season in the Western Pacific. The harbor at Rabaul would have been quieter after the convoy departed. The volcanic rim that encircles Simpson Harbor is steep enough to dampen sound from the open water, and once the throb of 11 sets of transport engines faded into the distance, what remained was the usual noise of a forward operating base, aircraft maintenance, supply movements, the hum of radio transmitters. The 25th Air Flotilla's G-4M medium bombers and H-6K flying boats would continue their reconnaissance missions from the airfields and anchorages around Rabaul, searching south and east for the enemy fleet. But the decisive act had already occurred. The transports were committed. The timetable was running. And somewhere to the south, 2 American carriers were already waiting in the blue water of the Coral Sea, positioned by fragmentary intelligence and an admiral's trust in a cryptanalyst's question mark. The distance between the convoy and those carriers was closing at a combined rate of roughly 30 knots. The collision was arithmetic now, not strategy. And the arithmetic, measured in nautical miles and hours and fuel consumption rates, favored the side that already knew where to look. Chapter 3. The Man Who Wasn't Nagumo. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi was a man of the surface fleet. His career, as reconstructed from surviving Imperial Japanese Navy personnel records and the biographical appendices of the Senshi Sosho, followed a trajectory that any torpedo officer of his generation would have recognized. Destroyer commands, torpedo school postings, cruiser division leadership. He understood the geometry of surface engagements, the firing arcs of the long-lance torpedo, the calculus of closing speed and bearing angle, the visceral rhythm of a night surface action, where ranges collapsed from 10,000 meters to point blank in minutes. He was, by all accounts, competent, experienced, and professionally respected. He was also, as of May 1942, in command of a carrier striking force, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, Carrier Division 5, and he had never, in his entire career, commanded or served aboard a carrier. He had no aviation qualification, no carrier aviation staff tour, no time at Yokosuka Air Group. The weapons system he was now responsible for employing, 120-some aircraft, their pilots, their maintenance crews, their ordnance, the entire complex organism of carrier air operations, was something he understood intellectually, but not instinctively. And in the fog of war, when decisions had to be made in minutes or seconds, instinct outpaces intellect. Every time. The notation appears in the records of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the massive post-war interrogation and analysis program that debriefed Japanese military officers after the surrender. Takagi was interrogated as part of the Naval series. The USSBS interrogation transcript, Naval Series number 55, contains his account of the Coral Sea operation, delivered in the careful, measured tones of a defeated officer speaking to his captors. At some point during or after the interrogation, someone, possibly the interrogating officer, possibly a staff analyst reviewing the transcript later, penciled 2 words in the margin of the document, "not aviator." It's shorthand, but it captures, in 2 words, the structural deficiency at the heart of the Japanese carrier force at Coral Sea. The man in tactical command of the carriers wasn't a carrier man. He was a torpedo man commanding a weapons system that operated in a dimension, the air, that he had never inhabited. The penciled note was an interrogator's realization. It should have been a Japanese personnel officer's concern, months or years earlier. It wasn't. This was not a peculiarity of Takagi's assignment. It was a systemic feature of the Imperial Japanese Navy's promotion and command structure. The IJN, like most navies of its era, was dominated by surface warfare lineages, battleship officers, cruiser officers, destroyer and torpedo specialists. These were the men who rose to flag rank, who commanded fleets, who shaped doctrine. Aviation, despite its growing importance, remained a secondary specialty in the promotion hierarchy. The result was predictable. Carrier forces were commanded by non-aviators. The most famous example is Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who led the Kido Butai, the combined fleet's main carrier striking force, at Pearl Harbor in the Indian Ocean and ultimately at Midway. Nagumo, like Takagi, was a torpedo specialist. His command of the carriers was a function of seniority, not expertise. The parallel between Nagumo and Takagi is frequently noted in the Midway literature. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully's Shattered Sword, published in 2005, makes the point with particular force, but it is insufficiently examined for Coral Sea specifically, because at Coral Sea the consequences were more subtle. Nagumo's non-aviator instincts at Midway produced a single catastrophic decision, the rearming of his strike aircraft. Takagi's non-aviator instincts at Coral Sea produced something harder to see, a pattern of hesitation, of delayed search launches, of conservative approach routes that ceded initiative. Not a single dramatic error, but a pervasive operational caution that, accumulated over several days, left the Japanese carriers perpetually one step behind. Beneath Takagi in the command structure sat Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, commanding Carrier Division 5 from his flag bridge aboard Zuikaku. Hara was an aviator, or at least closer to one than Takagi. He had aviation experience, understood the operational rhythms of carrier air groups, and was responsible for the actual conduct of air operations, launch decisions, strike composition, arming orders, recovery schedules. The command architecture of the force split authority between the 2 admirals. Takagi controlled force movement, where the carriers went, how fast they steamed, what formation they adopted. Hara controlled what the carriers did with their aircraft, when to launch, what to arm them with, how to compose the strike package. In theory, this was a functional division of labor. In practice, it created a seam, a gap between the man who moved the ships and the man who flew the planes. A decision to launch a strike required both admirals to agree on timing and direction, and if they assessed the same intelligence differently, if the surface officer's instinct to preserve the force conflicted with the aviator's instinct to find and strike the enemy, the result was delay. At Coral Sea, that seam would open repeatedly. The evidence for friction between Takagi and Hara comes from multiple post-war sources, and they don't entirely agree. Hara's own accounts, including the book Japanese Destroyer Captain, published with American co-author Fred Saito, contain implications of frustration with Takagi's caution, particularly regarding the timing of strike launches on the 7th of May. Hara suggests, without stating outright, that Takagi slowed the decision-making process, that opportunities were missed because the force commander was too careful. Takagi's own USSBS testimony is more guarded, attributing delays to weather conditions and ambiguous search contacts rather than to command friction. The Senshi Sosho, drawing on both Japanese and captured records, presents a more neutral account, but acknowledges that the Takagi-Hara relationship was a coordination challenge. Which version is closest to the truth? I don't know. Hara had reason to deflect blame upward after the war. Takagi had reason to be diplomatic about a subordinate relationship that was over and done. The Senshi Sosho compilers had institutional reasons to avoid assigning personal blame within the officer corps. What I can say with confidence is that the structural problem, a non-aviator commanding an aviator in a carrier battle, is documented fact, not post-war interpretation. And that structural problem didn't require personal animosity to produce operational consequences. It only required 2 men with different instincts to face an ambiguous situation and respond at different speeds. When I look at the track charts for Takagi's force, the reconstructed movement plots in the Senshi Sosho showing the carrier striking force's route from Truk into the Coral Sea. What I see is a surface officer's approach. The route swings wide around the Eastern Solomons, adding hundreds of miles to the transit, consuming fuel that would later constrain tactical freedom. The purpose of this wide approach was to avoid detection, to stay out of range of Allied coastwatcher networks and land-based search aircraft in the Solomons. It was a sound defensive instinct. It was also a cautious instinct. An aviator, a man whose career had been shaped by the offensive ethos of carrier aviation, where finding the enemy first and striking first was the whole game, might have chosen a more aggressive route, accepting the risk of detection in exchange for arriving in the battle area sooner, with more fuel, and with the initiative. I'm speculating here, and I want to be honest about that. There's no document that says an aviator commander would have taken a different route, but the logic of the approach route, wide, cautious, fuel-consuming, oriented toward avoiding detection rather than gaining position, reads like a torpedo officer's plan. And a torpedo officer's plan for a carrier battle may not be the right plan. Hara, for his part, had his own vulnerabilities. He had commanded Carrier Division 5 for less than 4 months when the Coral Sea operation began. Shōkaku and Zuikaku were the newest fleet carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, commissioned in August and September of 1941, barely half a year before Pearl Harbor. Their air groups had participated in the Pearl Harbor strike and in subsequent raids in the Indian Ocean and against Readiness, but always as part of the larger Kido Butai, always alongside the 4 other fleet carriers that formed the core of Japan's carrier force. Carrier Division 5 had never operated independently. It had never been the sole carrier force in a theater. It had never faced an enemy carrier force without the reassuring presence of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu somewhere on the horizon. At Coral Sea, it would be alone. 2 carriers, 2 admirals with different instincts, an air group that had never been tested independently, against an enemy who was already in position and waiting. The structural fragility of this arrangement, untested subunit, untested air commander, non-aviator force commander, was enormous, and no one in the Japanese command structure seems to have flagged it as a concern. The operation proceeded as planned. The plan assumed everything would work as designed, and as the events of the 7th and 8th of May would demonstrate, in carrier warfare, almost nothing works as designed. The 2 carriers themselves, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, were formidable ships. Each displaced 32,105 tons standard, making them the largest and most capable fleet carriers in the Japanese Navy. Each carried an air group of roughly 63 aircraft, 21 A6M0 fighters, 21 D3 Aval dive bombers, and 21 B5N Kate torpedo bombers. Their flight decks were over 240 meters long. Their engineering plants could push them to 34 knots. They were, in isolation, among the most powerful warships afloat. But a carrier's power is not in its hull or its engines. It's in the coordination between the ship, the air group, and the command structure that directs them. A carrier with a brilliant air group and an indecisive commander is a fast ship with a lot of planes that don't launch at the right time. And at Coral Sea, the coordination, the seam between Takagi's movement decisions and Hara's aviation decisions, would be tested in ways that peacetime exercises had never anticipated. The combined displacement of those 2 carriers, 64,210 tons, represented roughly 1/3 of Japan's total fleet carrier tonnage. It was a staggering commitment of irreplaceable assets, and it was placed under the command of a man whose specialty qualification, as recorded in his personnel file, read, Suirai, torpedo warfare. The transit continued. Takagi's force pushed south and west through the Solomon Sea, the carriers screened by heavy cruisers and destroyers, the formation maintaining a cruising speed designed to conserve fuel. The weather grew warmer and wetter as they approached the equatorial convergence zone. Somewhere ahead of them, they didn't know exactly where, were the American carriers that the MO plan assumed would not be there. And somewhere behind them, the slow transports of the invasion convoy were beginning their own ponderous passage south from Rabaul. The 2 forces, carriers and transports, were on converging courses but separate timelines, linked by the operational plan but unable to communicate freely without risking the radio interception that had already, unbeknownst to them, compromised the operation's outline. Takagi didn't know that Nimitz knew. Hara didn't know that Rochefort's basement had read M.O. and guessed right. The plan was still running, the timetable was still on schedule, and the man at the top of the carrier force's chain of command was, at his core, a man who thought in terms of torpedoes and surface ranges, not in terms of aircraft cycles and deck load strikes. It wouldn't matter if everything went according to plan. But nothing was going to go according to plan. The light in the western Pacific at those latitudes has a particular quality in the late afternoon. Heavy, golden, filtered through the moisture in the atmosphere, so that the horizon takes on a hazy, indistinct character. Distances are hard to judge. A ship at 20 miles might be visible. A ship at 15 might disappear behind a curtain of humidity. For a surface officer, trained in a world where visual contact determined engagement range, this environment was familiar. For a carrier force, which operated at ranges measured in hundreds of miles and depended on aircraft, not eyesight, to find the enemy, the haze was irrelevant. The battle would be fought beyond visual range, by air crews who would fly out, strike, and attempt to find their way back. Takagi's instincts, the instincts of a man who had spent his career judging distances through binoculars on a bridge wing, would be of limited use. The battle, when it came, would belong to aviators. And the aviators, at Coral Sea, reported to a man who understood them through the language of briefings and operational orders, not through the shared experience of having sat in a cockpit and felt the carrier's deck drop away beneath the wheels. Chapter 4. Fletcher's Fuel Obsession. The oiler Neosho was not the kind of ship that historians remember. She was a Cimarron-class fleet oiler, naval designation AO-23, and her function was as unglamorous as it was essential. She carried fuel oil and aviation gasoline from rear area supply points to the combatant ships at the front, pumping her cargo through hoses to warships steaming alongside at 8 to 10 knots, in the laborious, vulnerable process known as underway replenishment. She displaced about 7,383 tons empty, and substantially more with a full cargo of approximately 34,000 barrels of fuel oil. She had no armor. Her armament was a few anti-aircraft guns. Her top speed was barely 18 knots. She was, in every respect, a support vessel, invisible in the operational narrative until something went wrong. And something was about to go very wrong. But before that, she was the object of an almost neurotic attention from the man commanding the Allied carrier forces in the Coral Sea, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who spent more of his operational bandwidth in the first week of May 1942 worrying about Neosho and her fuel than he spent on almost any other tactical consideration. This obsession has been called timidity by historians for decades. I think it was the opposite. I think it was the clearest thinking anyone did in the entire battle. Fletcher's action report for the Battle of the Coral Sea, CINCPAC file, held at the National Archives, contains passages that read less like a combat commander's narrative and more like a fuel accountant's spreadsheet. He lists individual ships' fuel percentages. He details planned fueling schedules. He notes which destroyers are below 50%, which cruisers have comfortable margins, which ships need priority access to the oiler. The level of detail is obsessive. And it's obsessive because Fletcher understood, with a clarity that his critics, writing after the war when the outcome was known, did not, that carrier operations in the Coral Sea in May 1942 were a fuel problem first and a combat problem second. His task force was operating at the far end of a logistical tether. The nearest friendly port with adequate fueling facilities was over 2,000 nautical miles to the southeast. His destroyers, the thin-skinned escorts that provided the anti-submarine and anti-aircraft screen, without which his carriers were vulnerable, burned fuel at rates that gave them, at best, 5 days of high-speed operations before they needed to refuel. If he lost his oiler, if Neosho was sunk or damaged beyond use, his destroyers would begin running dry within days. And a carrier without its destroyer screen is not a warship. It is a target. The criticism of Fletcher's fuel management comes primarily from one source, and it is echoed through the literature for over 6 decades. Samuel Eliot Morison, in Volume 4 of his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, published in 1949, portrays Fletcher as overly cautious, a commander who wasted time refueling when he should have been closing the enemy, who missed opportunities because he was tethered to his oiler schedule, who allowed the Japanese to seize the initiative at Tulagi, while he was topping off his destroyers. Morrison's criticism was influential because Morrison was influential. His multi-volume history was the canonical account of the naval war for a generation. But Morrison's account has a problem. He had privileged access to Navy records and to the Navy's senior leadership, including Admiral Ernest King, who had his own reasons for being critical of Fletcher. But he did not have access to Fletcher's complete operational traffic. He didn't see the fuel state reports. He didn't see the messages from individual ships reporting critically low reserves. He saw the outcome. Fletcher spent time refueling and applied a judgment, timidity, without fully examining the operational context that made refueling not a choice, but a necessity. The rehabilitation of Fletcher's reputation is largely the work of one historian, John B. Lundstrom, whose 2006 biography, Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, reconstructed Fletcher's decision-making from the operational records that Morrison either didn't have or didn't use. Lundstrom's argument is straightforward. Fletcher's refueling pauses were rational responses to real logistical constraints, and the timidity narrative originated not from the operational evidence, but from the institutional politics of the wartime Navy, where Fletcher had enemies, Gormley, King's staff, who were predisposed to criticize him. The evidence Lundstrom presents is, to me, compelling. Fletcher's destroyers were, in fact, critically low on fuel after the high-speed run to Tulagi on the 3rd of May. His oiler was, in fact, his only source of fuel in a theater with no forward bases. His decision to spend nearly 24 hours refueling on the 4th and 5th of May was, in fact, driven by fuel state reports showing multiple escorts below the 50% threshold that Fletcher considered the minimum for sustained combat operations. You can argue that Fletcher should have accepted the risk and pressed forward, but you can only make that argument if you're willing to accept the possibility that his destroyers might have run dry mid-battle, leaving his carriers without escorts in waters where Japanese submarines were known to be operating. Fletcher wasn't willing to accept that possibility. I wouldn't have been either. The refueling process itself was a misery of seamanship. Underway replenishment in 1942 required the receiving ship to pull alongside the oiler at a distance of roughly 40 meters, both vessels steaming on a parallel course at 8 to 10 knots. Lines were passed across the gap using a boatswain's line gun. Fuel hoses, heavy, awkward, prone to leaking, were rigged between the ships and connected to fueling stations. The pump rate was dictated by the hose diameter and the oiler's pumping capacity. A single destroyer might need 2 to 4 hours to top off. A cruiser took longer. During the entire process, both ships had to maintain a constant course and speed. No evasive maneuvering, no sudden turns, no response to submarine contacts, except to cut the hoses and separate, which took precious minutes. The formation was, during fueling, radiating a large wake signature visible from the air, steaming in a predictable pattern, and unable to defend itself against any serious attack. Fletcher's refueling pauses weren't laziness. They were multi-hour windows of extreme vulnerability that he scheduled as carefully as he could, in waters where he knew the Japanese had submarines and long-range patrol aircraft. Every hour alongside the oiler was an hour of exposure, and every hour away from the oiler brought his destroyers closer to empty. On the 3rd of May, Fletcher made a decision that would be debated for decades. Learning that the Japanese had landed troops at Tulagi, the southern Solomon seaplane base that was one of Operation MO's secondary objectives, Fletcher detached his force from the fueling rendezvous and steamed north to strike the landing force. He hit Tulagi on the morning of the 4th, launching 3 strikes from Yorktown against the Japanese ships in the harbor. The results were mixed. Several small vessels sunk, but the main transport force escaped significant damage, and Fletcher's pilots overclaimed their results dramatically. Morrison called the Tulagi detour impulsive. Lundstrom called it a calculated strike of opportunity, noting that Fletcher had intelligence suggesting the Tulagi force was unscreened by carriers and therefore vulnerable. Fletcher's own action report is characteristically terse. He reports what he did without extensive justification, in the manner of a man who didn't think the decision required defense. The sources genuinely conflict on this point, and the resolution depends on what intelligence Fletcher actually had at the moment of decision, a question that the surviving records don't fully answer. What isn't debatable is the consequence. The Tulagi strikes burned fuel. His destroyers, running at high speed for the approach and recovery, consumed reserves that pushed several below the critical threshold. The refueling pause that followed, the pause Morrison called timid, was a direct result of the Tulagi detour that Morrison called impulsive. You can't have it both ways. Either Fletcher was wrong to go to Tulagi and right to refuel afterward, or right to go to Tulagi and wrong to refuel. The critique only works if Fletcher was wrong about everything, which is the kind of judgment that says more about the critic than the criticized. On the 6th of May, Fletcher made another decision that would reverberate catastrophically. He detached Neosho, with the destroyer Sims as escort, to a rendezvous point south of the expected combat zone. The purpose was simple: get the oiler out of harm's way. The fuel she carried, approximately 34,000 barrels, or roughly 5,440 tons of fuel oil, was irreplaceable in the theater. There was no backup oiler within operational range. If Neosho was lost, Fletcher's task force would be operating on whatever fuel its ships already had in their bunkers, with no ability to replenish. The decision to send her south was prudent by any reasonable standard. The rendezvous point was selected to be well away from the anticipated area of carrier operations. What Fletcher couldn't know, what no one on the Allied side could know, was that the Japanese carrier striking force, approaching from the east, would have its search aircraft ranging in exactly the area where Neosho was heading. The safe point wasn't safe, and the oiler that Fletcher had been so carefully protecting would find itself, on the morning of the 7th, squarely in the path of a Japanese carrier strike force, looking for American carriers and willing to see one in anything that floated. The irony is almost too precise to bear. Fletcher's precaution placed Neosho in exactly the danger his precaution was meant to prevent. It's worth pausing to consider the fuel situation from the Japanese side, because the constraint wasn't uniquely American. Takagi's carriers, having taken the wide approach route around the Solomons, were also operating with limited fuel reserves. His escorting destroyers faced the same arithmetic Fletcher's did: burn rate versus remaining bunker capacity, with no oiler conveniently positioned for a top-off. The Senshi Sosho's estimated fuel tables for the carrier striking force show a force that was adequately fueled for the planned operation, but had little margin for deviation. If the battle lasted longer than expected, if the carriers needed to make extended high-speed runs, if the destroyers had to conduct anti-submarine sweeps, the fuel situation would tighten rapidly. Both sides were fighting with their fuel gauges and their peripheral vision. Both sides were constrained by the same physics. Ships burn fuel, fuel runs out, and the Coral Sea was a very long way from anywhere that sold fuel to warships. When I sit with Fletcher's action report and read the fuel state paragraphs, the careful listings of percentages, the planned schedules, the contingency calculations, I don't see timidity. I see a man who understood that carrier warfare at the edge of a logistical tether is fundamentally a logistics problem that occasionally becomes a combat problem. The combat gets the headlines. The logistics determines whether you're in a position to fight at all. Fletcher wasn't cautious because he lacked aggression. He was cautious because he had done the arithmetic. He knew that 2 carriers operating without fuel were worth less than 1 carrier operating with it. He knew that Neosho's 34,000 barrels represented not just fuel, but freedom of action, the ability to maneuver, to chase, to evade, to sustain operations for more than a few days. And he knew that if he lost that fuel, he was trapped. The critique of Fletcher as timid is, I think, a critique written by men who never had to calculate whether their escorts could make it home. Lundstrom's rehabilitation stands on evidence. Morrison's criticism stands on atmosphere. I know which I trust, but I also know that historians aren't finished arguing about it, and I don't expect they will be anytime soon. Neosho steams south on the morning of the 6th, with Sims alongside, for what protection a single destroyer could offer against whatever the Coral Sea might produce. The sun climbed, the sea was calm, the sky was clear, and somewhere to the northeast, the Japanese carrier striking force's search aircraft were preparing for their morning sweeps, looking for American carriers, looking for flat-decked ships, looking for anything that might be the enemy fleet. Neosho's broad, unobstructed main deck, roughly 500 feet of flat surface, was about to present a silhouette that, from 15,000 feet, through broken cloud, looked very much like something she wasn't. Chapter 5. The Spreadsheet of Destruction. Air Order of Battle, the 7th of May, 1942. On the morning of the 7th of May, 1942, somewhere in the warren of compartments below Yorktown's flight deck, A typewriter produced a document. The document was a table, rows and columns, aircraft types and bureau numbers, status codes. It was the kind of administrative paperwork that exists in every military unit in every war, the bureaucratic skeleton beneath the muscle of combat operations. Yorktown's Air Group Action Report, which would eventually be filed under its serial number at the National Archives, contains this table as an appendix: the operational status of every aircraft in the air group on the morning the shooting started. Next to several SBD Dauntless dive bombers, the typist had entered down, engine. Next to a TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, down, hydraulic. These are not dramatic entries. No one was going to make a film about a hydraulic failure, but each down entry represents a subtraction from the force available to launch. And by the morning of the 7th, those subtractions had accumulated to a point that the table, read carefully, tells a story the battle narrative never does. Before the first bomb fell, both sides were already diminished, and the margin between enough aircraft and not enough was thinner than anyone on either flag bridge fully understood. Yorktown's nominal air group strength was approximately 72 aircraft, a fighter squadron of Grumman F-4, F-3 Wildcats, 2 scouting bombing squadrons of Douglas S, B, D-3 Dauntlesses, and a torpedo squadron of Douglas T, B, D-1 Devastators. Nominal means on the roster. Operational, meaning fueled, armed, mechanically sound, and available to launch, was a different number. On the morning of the 7th, Yorktown's operational strength was approximately 63 aircraft. The gap of 9 represented the accumulated erosion of weeks of operational tempo, engines that needed cylinder changes, hydraulic systems that leaked, electrical faults in bomb release mechanisms, airframes with structural damage from hard landings. None of these aircraft had been shot down. They had simply worn out, in the way that complex machines wear out when operated continuously in a salt-air, high-humidity environment by maintenance crews who were themselves exhausted. Lexington's air group, embarked on the other American carrier, was in a similar state. Nominal strength of roughly 71 aircraft, operational strength of approximately 64. The combined American air strength that morning was on paper about 143 aircraft. In reality, it was about 127. That gap of 16, aircraft that existed but couldn't fly, was invisible on any tactical plot, and it was real. The Japanese numbers were, if anything, more concerning beneath the surface. Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the Carrier Division 5 fleet carriers, had a combined nominal strength of approximately 126 aircraft, a formidable number that gave them, on paper, rough parity with the 2 American carriers. But the exact operational figure on the morning of the 7th is disputed, and the dispute itself is instructive. The Sinking of Shōhō suggests approximately 121 operational aircraft. John Lundstrom, in his 1984 study The First Team, the most meticulous examination of carrier air combat in the early Pacific War, estimates closer to 115 to 118. The discrepancy isn't trivial. It's a difference of 3 to 6 aircraft, which in a battle decided by margins would matter. The gap arises from differing treatments of aircraft damaged during transit operations. Planes that weren't shot down, but were rendered unserviceable by the routine wear of carrier operations. Hard landings, engine failures, propeller damage. Lundstrom's methodology counts only aircraft confirmed as mission capable through cross-referencing multiple source types. The Sinking of Shōhō tends to list assigned strength, which includes aircraft that might technically be on the ship but aren't ready to fly. I use Lundstrom's lower figure as the working number because his counting methodology is more conservative and more rigorous, and in a narrative about why Japan lost, precision matters more than generosity. Then there was Shōhō. The light carrier providing close air cover for the invasion convoy carried an air group of exactly 21 aircraft. 12 A6M0 fighters, and 9 Type 97 carrier attack planes. 21 aircraft. That's the total air strength covering the 11 transports, 5,500 troops, and 72,000 tons of shipping that constituted the entire purpose of Operation MO. Shōhō wasn't designed to fight a carrier battle. She was designed to provide a local air umbrella, combat air patrol overhead, anti-submarine patrols around the convoy, maybe a small strike capability against unescorted surface targets. Against a full American carrier strike of 60 or 70 aircraft, she was not a combatant. She was a speed bump. The disparity between her 21 aircraft and the combined American air strength of 127 operational aircraft was not a gap. It was an abyss. And the operational plan assumed that the fleet carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, would have neutralized or distracted the American carriers before anyone got near Shōhō. When that assumption failed, Shōhō's 21 aircraft wouldn't save her. Nothing would. The aircraft themselves, the specific machines, not the aggregate numbers, deserve attention, because the metal and the engineering mattered as much as the tactics. Yorktown's torpedo squadron, VT-5, was equipped with the TBD-1 Devastator, and every pilot in that squadron knew what they were sitting in. The Devastator was obsolescent. It had entered service in 1937, and by 1942, it was already outclassed by the aircraft it was expected to attack into. Its maximum speed while carrying a Mark 13 torpedo was approximately 115 knots, not miles per hour, knots, roughly 132 miles per hour. That is slower than some Japanese fighters could cruise. The attack profile required the pilot to fly at an altitude of between 50 and 80 feet, essentially wave-top height, on a straight, level approach to the target for the final 30 seconds before release. Straight, level. At 115 knots, into anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. The math was simple and brutal. The pilots of VT-5 knew that math. They flew anyway. Calling this bravery flattens it into something heroic and manageable. It was something more specific and more disturbing. It was the calculated acceptance of near-suicidal odds by men who understood those odds with professional clarity, and flew because there was no replacement aircraft and the mission existed. I've spent more time with aircraft readiness tables during the research for this project than I have with any battle map or tactical diagram. Battle maps are clean. They show arrows and ship positions and engagement ranges. They suggest that outcomes flow from decisions, and decisions flow from intelligence, and intelligence flows from code breaking, all of which is true as far as it goes. But readiness tables are dirty. They show the reality beneath the arrows. How many planes actually flew? How many sat in the hangar with leaking hydraulic lines? How many had engines that needed a cylinder change, but got patched instead because there weren't enough spare cylinders aboard? The readiness table is where the war lives, not in the admiral's war room, but in the maintenance chief's notebook. And I've come to believe that the chief petty officers with grease under their nails, the men who kept those SBDs and Kates and Zeros flying through salt corrosion and parts shortages and round-the-clock operations, had more influence on the outcome of the Coral Sea than any flag officer's tactical decision. You can't launch what isn't ready, and ready was a moving target that the maintenance crews chased every hour of every day. The environmental toll on these aircraft was relentless and specific. The F-4, F-3 Wildcats Pratt & Whitney R-1830-76 engine, a 14-cylinder, twin-row radial producing roughly 1,200 horsepower, required a major inspection every 300 flight hours, and a cylinder change at approximately 150 hours under normal conditions. In the Coral Sea's environment, temperatures above 30 Celsius, humidity above 80%, constant salt spray on deck-parked aircraft, gasket degradation and carburetor fouling accelerated. The gap between normal conditions and combat conditions could halve the maintenance intervals. A Wildcat that was sound in the morning might, after a 3-hour combat air patrol in tropical heat, need 4 to 6 hours of maintenance before it was mission-capable again. The number of available fighters at any given moment was not a fixed quantity. It fluctuated with the maintenance cycle, with the weather, with the cumulative stress on airframes that were being pushed harder than their designers had intended. The readiness tables captured snapshots. The reality was a moving picture, and the picture was always slightly worse than the snapshot suggested. Both sides also had land-based air assets in the theater, and their contribution, while marginal to the carrier battle itself, was significant for the search effort that preceded it. On the Allied side, B-17 heavy bombers, B-26 medium bombers, and Australian Hudson patrol aircraft operated from bases in northeastern Australia and Port Moresby, conducting long-range search missions over the Coral Sea and Solomon Sea. Their ability to find and shadow Japanese naval forces contributed to the intelligence picture that Fletcher used to position his carriers. On the Japanese side, the 25th Air Flotilla at Rabaul operated G-4M Betty medium bombers and H-6K Mavis flying boats in a reconnaissance role, searching south and east for the American carriers. The land-based aircraft on both sides were better suited to the search mission than to the attack mission. B-17s bombing ships at sea had proven spectacularly inaccurate in every engagement to date, and the Bettys, while carrying torpedoes, were vulnerable to fighter interception at the low altitudes required for torpedo attacks. But finding the enemy was, in carrier warfare, half the battle. And the search aircraft, unglamorous as they were the eyes that would determine who found whom first on the morning of the 7th. The combined aircraft capacity of the 4 carriers that would be directly engaged in the battle, Yorktown, Lexington, Shōkaku, and Zuikaku, was approximately 287 aircraft on paper. The operational total was closer to 248. That gap of 39 aircraft, 13.6% of paper strength, was the invisible attrition of maintenance, accidents, and fatigue that no battle map ever shows. 39 aircraft that were listed on rosters and counted in intelligence estimates, but couldn't actually fly. Both sides, when they planned their operations, used paper strength figures. Both sides believed the other was stronger than it actually was, and both sides were weaker than they believed themselves to be. The battle would be fought not between 287 aircraft, but between 248, and the difference between those numbers, the gap between what was listed and what was real, would shape every engagement that followed. When the strikes launched on the 7th of May, they would be smaller than planned, less concentrated than doctrine required, and more vulnerable to loss than anyone had budgeted for. The spreadsheet, with its mundane entries of down engine and down hydraulic, was already writing the battle's outcome in a language that no one on either flag bridge was reading closely enough. Somewhere in the maintenance spaces below Yorktown's hangar deck, the work continued. Mechanics pulled inspection panels, checked oil levels, tightened hydraulic fittings, replaced corroded electrical connectors. The tools clanked. The ventilation fans pushed warm, oil-scented air through the compartments. The readiness board, a physical board marked with grease pencil listing each aircraft's status, was updated and erased and updated again as machines moved from down to up and back to down. The board was the pulse of the air group, and its rhythm was not steady. It stuttered and surged with every repair completed and every new fault discovered. In a few hours, the aircraft that were up would be fueled, armed, loaded onto elevators, raised to the flight deck, and launched into a sky that neither they nor their pilots would all return from. But for now, the readiness board was the war, and the grease pencil, wielded by a maintenance chief who hadn't slept enough, was the instrument that determined what was possible. Chapter 6. The Wrong Ships, the 7th of May, 1942. Sometime around 0736 on the morning of the 7th of May, 1942, a Japanese search pilot, flying a B-5N Kate from one of the fleet carriers, altitude approximately 4,500 meters, visibility variable through broken tropical cloud, looked down at the Coral Sea and saw what he had been sent to find. Below him, steaming on a southerly course, were 2 ships. One was large, with a long, flat profile. The other was smaller, escorting. The pilot's training, his mission brief, his expectation, all told him the same thing. He keyed his radio and transmitted a contact report. 1 carrier, 1 cruiser. The coordinates placed the sighting at Neosho's position. The message was encoded, transmitted across the miles of ocean to the carrier striking force, received, decoded, and presented to Vice Admiral Takagi and Rear Admiral Hara. The contact was assessed. The decision was made. Hara launched a full strike, 78 aircraft, nearly the entire offensive capability of the 2 fleet carriers, against the contact. The aircraft armed, launched, formed up, and flew south. They were heading for a fleet oiler and a single destroyer. The flat-decked ship that the search pilot had identified as a carrier was Neosho, the same oiler that Fletcher had sent to a safe rendezvous point the day before. The smaller ship was the destroyer Sims. Neither was a carrier, neither was a cruiser, and 78 aircraft, dive bombers loaded with 250-kilogram bombs, torpedo bombers carrying Type 91 aerial torpedoes, fighters for escort, were now committed to destroying them. The Japanese carrier striking force had just fired its main battery at a fuel truck. The misidentification was not stupidity. It's important to establish that clearly, because the temptation to mock the error is strong, and the mockery is unfair. Ship recognition from aircraft in 1942 was conducted visually, from altitude, through whatever atmospheric conditions happened to prevail. Training consisted of studying silhouette cards and scale models, two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional objects viewed from a single angle. In practice, the pilot was looking down through thousands of feet of air, through cloud layers, through the haze of tropical humidity, at a ship he had seconds to evaluate, while also navigating, monitoring fuel, maintaining altitude, and scanning for enemy aircraft. Neosho, a Cimarron-class oiler, had a broad, unobstructed main deck running approximately 150 meters, not as long as a fleet carrier's flight deck, but similar enough in plan view outline, from altitude, to be confused with one, especially by a pilot who was told to look for a carrier, and whose pattern recognition was therefore primed for carrier shapes. The distinguishing features, superstructure configuration, island placement, the absence of flight deck markings, were details that compressed into ambiguity at altitude. Post-war analysis of World War II naval contact reports suggests that ship-type classification from aircraft was inaccurate in roughly 30 to 40% of cases. The Japanese pilot was operating within the known error rate of his sensor system, which happened to be his own eyes. He wasn't incompetent, he was human. On the American side, an almost identical error was unfolding at almost exactly the same time, as if the battle were writing itself in parallel columns of mutual blindness. At approximately 0815, an SBD Dauntless crew from Scouting Squadron 5, operating from Yorktown, reported a contact, 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers. The message went to Fletcher, 2 carriers. This was what Fletcher had been waiting for. The Japanese fleet carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, located and fixed. Fletcher committed everything. Both Yorktown and Lexington launched full strikes, a combined 93 aircraft, every available dive bomber and torpedo plane, with fighter escort. The aircraft formed up and headed for the contact coordinates. The problem was that the contact wasn't 2 carriers. It was 2 light cruisers and 2 gunboats of the Japanese covering group. There were no carriers at those coordinates. The debate over how this error occurred has persisted for decades. Lundstrom, in the first team, makes a persuasive case that the pilot correctly identified the ships, but that a coding error in the contact report, the ship-type code table used for encrypted transmissions, garbled 2CA, heavy cruisers, into 2CV, carriers. If Lundstrom is right, and I find his analysis convincing, the American strike was launched against the wrong target, not because of a visual misidentification, but because of a clerical error in encoding. A single wrong 2-letter code group that converted cruisers into carriers and sent 93 aircraft chasing a phantom. The fog of war isn't always fog. Sometimes it's a typographical error. The American strike, flying toward coordinates that didn't contain the fleet carriers, found something else instead. By luck, by the compound geography of the Coral Sea, their flight path took them over the Japanese covering group. And there, steaming below the cloud layer with her small escort, was the light carrier Shōhō. She was not the target they had been sent to find. She was smaller, lighter, less capable, 21 aircraft against 93 inbound. But she was a carrier, and the strike leaders made the on-scene decision to attack. What followed was brief and overwhelming. Shōhō was struck by an estimated 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes in a period of approximately 15 minutes. She burned. She listed. She went down at approximately 11:35, less than 20 minutes after the first bomb hit. Of her crew, approximately 631 were killed. The American strike leader, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon of Scouting Squadron 2, aboard Lexington, transmitted a report that entered the popular lexicon of the Pacific War. Scratch 1 flat top. It was the first time in history that an aircraft carrier had been sunk by aircraft from another carrier. It was a genuine milestone, and it was delivered against the wrong target. The fleet carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the real threat, were somewhere else, untouched, unfound. While 93 American aircraft were destroying Shōhō, the 78 Japanese aircraft launched against the carrier contact were arriving over Neosho and Sims. The realization, if it came at all during the approach, that the targets below were not fleet carriers but an oiler and a destroyer, did not prevent the attack. The aircraft had been armed, launched, formed, and flown. The mission existed. They attacked. Sims was hit by 3 bombs and sank rapidly, going down with almost all hands. Of her crew of approximately 252, 15 survived. Neosho, larger and more resilient, absorbed multiple bomb hits, 7 by most accounts, but did not sink immediately. She was left a drifting, burning wreck, without power, without communications, settling slowly by the stern. She would not be found by Allied rescue ships until the 11th of May, 4 days later. During those 4 days, her surviving crewmen, under the command of her captain, who maintained discipline and organized survival efforts despite catastrophic damage, endured on the open ocean with minimal water and no shelter from the equatorial sun. Approximately 68 men, who had abandoned ship on life rafts, drifted away from the wreck and were never found. They simply disappeared into the Coral Sea. Of Neosho's crew of approximately 293, 109 were eventually rescued. The rest were gone. Their story, the 4 days of drifting, the lost rafts, the slow dying, is almost never told in the standard Coral Sea narrative, which moves immediately from Neosho was hit to the carrier actions of May 8th. The oilers dead are footnotes in a battle about carriers. They deserve better than a footnote. By the afternoon of the 7th, both sides had assessed the results of the day's strikes, and both sides had arrived at the same uncomfortable realization. They had spent their offensive effort on the wrong targets. The Japanese learned that their 78 aircraft had sunk an oiler and a destroyer, not a carrier and a cruiser. The Americans learned that their 93 aircraft had sunk a light carrier, not the fleet carriers. The main enemy forces, the fleet carriers on both sides, were still intact, still at sea, and still unfound. The tonnage exchange tells the story in its own cold arithmetic. The Japanese had traded 78 strike sorties for approximately 7,383 tons of oiler, Neosho, and roughly 2,100 tons of destroyer, Sims. Total value, approximately 9,483 tons. The Americans had traded 93 strike sorties for approximately 11,262 tons of light carrier, Shōhō. Neither side got what it wanted. Both sides expended their primary offensive capability for the day against secondary targets, while the real adversaries sailed on, unharmed. When I sit with the track charts and the contact reports and the strike composition records for the 7th of May, what hits me hardest is the symmetry. Both sides made the same fundamental error, launched full strikes against misidentified or secondary targets. And both sides did it for the same fundamental reason. Carrier warfare in 1942 was conducted in a condition of near total blindness. The sensor was a pilot's eyes at altitude. The data link was a coded radio message that could be garbled in transmission. The intelligence picture was a map with a single plotted point and a label that might or might not be accurate. Neither side had radar-guided search, satellite imagery, real-time data fusion, or any of the other tools that modern navies use to build a coherent picture of the battle space. They had men in airplanes, looking down at water, trying to tell one ship from another at a distance of several miles through tropical weather. And they got it wrong. Both of them, on the same day, in the same battle. The fog of war at Coral Sea wasn't a metaphor. It was an operational reality defined by the limits of human visual perception at altitude. And it produced a day of combat in which neither side managed to find and strike the target that mattered. The darkest irony of the 7th belongs to Neosho. Fletcher had sent her south to protect her. He understood, better than almost anyone, how valuable her fuel cargo was. He calculated the risk and chose a rendezvous point that, based on his assessment of the likely combat area, should have been well clear of danger. His precaution was sound. His reasoning was correct, and the result was that Neosho steamed directly into the path of the Japanese carrier striking force's morning search pattern, a pattern that Fletcher couldn't predict because he didn't know Takagi's exact approach route. The safe zone became the kill zone. The oiler Fletcher had been so carefully protecting was destroyed by the very threat he was protecting her from. And her fuel, approximately 34,000 barrels, roughly 5,440 tons, went to the bottom of the Coral Sea, imposing a hard logistical ceiling on everything Fletcher could do for the rest of the battle. He had lost his oiler. He had lost his margin. The fuel obsession that Morrison called timidity had been, in hindsight, precisely calibrated to a threat that materialized exactly as Fletcher had feared it would, just in the wrong place, at the wrong time, against the wrong ship. Night was falling on the Coral Sea. The sky in those latitudes loses light quickly near the equator. The transition from sunset to full darkness takes barely 30 minutes. Somewhere to the north, the surviving crew of Neosho clung to the wreckage of their ship, the fires still burning in her ruptured compartments, the smell of fuel oil and smoke drifting across the water. Somewhere to the southeast, the shattered remnants of Shōhō lay scattered across the ocean floor, descending through thousands of fathoms of warm Pacific water. And somewhere between them, neither side knew exactly where, the fleet carriers sailed on, their air groups diminished by a day of misdirected effort, their pilots exhausted, their maintenance crews already at work preparing whatever aircraft remained operational for the morning. Tomorrow, the 8th of May, would be the real fight. Both sides knew the other was out there. Neither side knew exactly where. And both sides had just learned the same hard lesson, that carrier warfare in this spring of 1942 was a business conducted largely in the dark, where the difference between a decisive strike and a wasted one could come down to a single misidentified ship, a single garbled code group, a single pilot's eyes making a pattern recognition judgment in a fraction of a second at 15,000 feet. The main event was still 24 hours away. The combatants had been weakened, confused, and depleted. The readiness tables were already shorter, and the Coral Sea, indifferent to all of it, lay flat and dark under the emerging stars. Chapters 7 through 17 to follow. Next 6 chapters, approximately 2,000 to 2,500 words per chapter. 10 paragraphs, each paragraph around 4 to 6 sentences. Chapter 7, 27 minutes of twilight. The evening of the 7th of May, 1942, was the kind of tropical dusk that collapses fast, the sun dropping below the horizon at roughly 1830 local time, the sky bleeding from orange to violet to black in under half an hour. Aboard Yorktown and Lexington, steaming in formation roughly 100 nautical miles south of the morning's engagements, the day's adrenaline was fading into the particular exhaustion that follows sustained combat operations. Pilots who had flown the strike against Shōhō were debriefing, eating, trying to sleep. Maintenance crews were working on aircraft in the hangar bays, replacing spent ammunition, patching flak damage, checking engine oil levels. The combat air patrol was still up, a handful of wildcats orbiting the formation in the fading light, but the expectation was that the day's fighting was over. Darkness, in carrier warfare, was supposed to mean safety. Aircraft couldn't find targets at night. Strikes couldn't be launched or recovered in the dark. The night was a ceasefire, imposed by the limits of human vision and 1942 technology. That expectation was about to be proven wrong in the most disorienting way imaginable. Roughly 200 nautical miles to the northeast, Rear Admiral Hara had made a decision that Vice Admiral Takagi opposed. Hara wanted to find the American carriers before dawn. He wanted to launch a twilight search strike, a small force of aircraft, 27 in total, 12 D-3A Val dive bombers, and 15 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, to sweep south in the fading light, locate the enemy, and attack if possible. Takagi, the surface officer, preferred to wait until morning, when a full strike could be launched with proper search support and daylight for recovery. The disagreement, documented in the Senshi Sosho and referenced obliquely in both admirals' post-war testimonies, was another manifestation of the command seam described in Chapter 3. Hara, the aviator, saw an opportunity. Takagi, the torpedo man, saw risk. Hara's argument prevailed. At approximately 1815, the 27 aircraft launched from Shōkaku and Zuikaku into a sky that was already dimming. They flew south into the gathering dark, searching for ships they might not find, with a return flight that would be conducted in full darkness to carriers that had no reliable night recovery systems. It was, by any sober assessment, a gamble with terrible odds. The gamble failed almost immediately. The twilight search strike found nothing. No American carriers, no task force, no targets. The aircraft, fuel running low, turned back toward their own carriers in the dark. And then, the disorientation began. Navigation for carrier aircraft in 1942 relied on dead reckoning. The pilot's calculation of speed, heading, time, and wind drift applied to a starting position that was the carrier's location at the moment of launch. But the carrier had been maneuvering since launch. The wind had shifted. The pilot's calculations, accumulated over an hour of flight, carried compounding errors. At night, with no visual horizon references, the errors multiplied. The effective catchment area for a returning aircraft, the zone within which the pilot could visually or electronically detect his own carrier, was approximately 10 to 15 nautical miles. If the pilot's dead reckoning was off by more than that distance, he would simply fly past his ship in the darkness and never find it. For several of the returning Japanese aircraft, the error was large enough to send them not toward their own carriers, but toward the American task force. At approximately 1900 hours, Lexington's radar operators detected aircraft approaching the formation. The contacts were moving in a pattern consistent with carrier aircraft, seeking to enter a landing circle, the orbital approach path used before lining up for a carrier landing. Navigation lights were visible on some of the aircraft. They appeared to be friendlies returning from a mission. But no American strike had been launched that evening. The aircraft were Japanese. Lost, fuel depleted, disoriented in the darkness, they had found the first carrier formation their instruments or eyes could detect, and it was the wrong one. What followed was a span of approximately 27 minutes of pure confusion. The American Combat Air Patrol, still aloft in the fading light, was vectored toward the contacts. Wildcats and Japanese aircraft mixed in the darkening sky. Several Japanese planes were shot down. Others flew directly through the American formation at low altitude, close enough to be visible from the ship's bridges, their red-green navigation lights blinking in the darkness as they passed between the screening destroyers. The most surreal moment came at approximately 1910, when at least 3 Japanese aircraft, Kates based on their silhouettes, approached Yorktown in what appeared to be a standard carrier landing pattern. They flashed recognition signals. They lowered their landing hooks. They were, by every visible indication, attempting to land on Yorktown, apparently believing her to be one of their own carriers. The moment lasted perhaps 60 seconds before someone on Yorktown's bridge recognized the aircraft type, and the anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. The approaching aircraft scattered into the dark. The formation erupted in a brief, chaotic burst of gunfire, as nervous gunners on every ship in the task force fired at shadows, at each other's tracers, at the fading silhouettes of aircraft that might have been Japanese, or might have been the last American Combat Air Patrol, trying desperately not to be shot down by their own fleet. The incident lasted minutes. It felt, by survivor accounts, like hours. I keep returning to what it must have been like inside one of those Kate cockpits at 1910 on the 7th of May. You've been flying for over an hour. Your fuel gauge is approaching empty. The sky is black. You have no reliable way to find your own carrier. And then you see it, a flight deck, lights, the silhouette of a carrier in the darkness, the relief of finding home. You begin your approach. You flash your recognition signal. You lower your hook. And then the lights go out and tracers come up, and the relief inverts into terror in less than a heartbeat. That transition, from salvation to mortal danger in the space of a second, is the kind of experience that no operational history captures, because no operational history is written from inside the cockpit. The 27 minutes between dusk and full dark on the 7th of May were a kind of madness, and the men who lived through them, on both sides, carried a particular understanding of how thin the membrane between order and chaos actually was in carrier warfare. Of the 27 Japanese aircraft launched on the Twilight mission, only 18 returned to their carriers. 9 were lost, some to American fighters, some to anti-aircraft fire during the accidental approach on the American formation, some to fuel exhaustion and failed night water landings. 9 aircraft gone, not to a strike, not to a battle, to a search mission that found nothing, and a return flight conducted in darkness that the aircraft and crews were not equipped to survive. Those 9 aircraft represented approximately 7.6% of the Japanese carrier's remaining operational air strength. More importantly, they represented 9 experienced air crews, pilots, observers, radio men, with the kind of accumulated flight hours and combat experience that the Japanese naval aviation training pipeline could not replace at anything approaching the rate the war was consuming them. The loss was pure subtraction, zero operational return. The Japanese carrier striking force was measurably weaker on the morning of the 8th than it had been on the evening of the 7th, and the cause was not enemy action in any meaningful strategic sense. It was a self-inflicted wound. The quiet revelation of the Twilight debacle is what it does to the narrative established in Chapter 3, the narrative of Takagi, the cautious surface officer, and Hara, the aggressive aviator. The easy reading of their command dynamic is that Takagi's caution was the liability, and Hara's aggression was the asset. The Twilight mission inverts that reading. This was a case where the surface officer's instinct, wait for morning, don't launch into deteriorating conditions, was correct, and the aviator's instinct, seize the opportunity, press the advantage, was wrong. Hara's aggression cost 9 aircraft and 9 irreplaceable crews for nothing. Takagi's caution, had it prevailed, would have preserved them. The simple story, non-aviator bad, aviator good, doesn't survive contact with the evidence. The reality is more complicated and less satisfying. Both instincts were sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and the command seam between them produced outcomes that were worse than either admiral's judgment would have produced alone. The Americans, for their part, spent the night after the Twilight encounter in a state of heightened anxiety that further eroded the sleep and readiness of an already exhausted force. The anti-aircraft gunners remained at battle stations. The radar operators stared at their screens, waiting for contacts that didn't come. The combat air patrol pilots, who had been aloft during the incident, landed in near total darkness, itself a dangerous operation, and reported a confused engagement in which positive identification of targets had been almost impossible. Nobody slept well. The maintenance crews continued working on aircraft in the hangar bays, but the pace was affected by the repeated calls to general quarters, as nervous lookouts reported contacts that turned out to be nothing. By dawn on the 8th, both sides had been awake for most of the night. Both sides were depleted. The Japanese by the loss of 9 aircraft and crews, the Americans by the cumulative fatigue of sustained alert. The margin documented in Chapter 5, the gap between paper strength and operational reality, had narrowed further, and the real battle was still hours away. The Coral Sea settled into full darkness. Somewhere in the water between the two carrier forces, the wreckage of 9 Japanese aircraft was sinking through the warm upper layers toward the cold and the pressure of the deep Pacific. Some of those aircraft still had men in them. The sea at those latitudes is over 4,000 meters deep. The descent would have taken hours. No one was counting. On the carriers, the ventilation fans hummed, the maintenance crews worked, and the readiness boards were updated with the grim arithmetic of what remained. Tomorrow would be clear skies for the Americans and cloud cover for the Japanese, a meteorological asymmetry that no one had planned and no one could change. The Twilight gamble was over, its cost was tallied, and the night, which was supposed to be a ceasefire, had instead been a preview of the confusion and misidentification that would define the entire battle. A battle fought by men who could barely see, against enemies they could barely find, with weapons they could barely control. Chapter 8. The morning of the 8th of May, parallel searches. The aerological officer aboard Yorktown filed his weather observation for the morning of the 8th of May, 1942, and the language was the clipped, standardized prose of military meteorology. Clear skies, visibility unlimited, scattered cumulus at approximately 600 meters. It was the kind of morning that carrier pilots pray for when they're launching, and dread when they're defending. Open sky, hard light, no place to hide. Every ship in the American formation was visible from altitude for dozens of miles in every direction, their wakes drawing white lines on the dark blue water, like chalk marks on a slate. The American carriers were, on the morning of the 8th, exposed under a sky so clear it felt malicious. Roughly 200 nautical miles to the north-northeast, the weather was different. The Japanese carrier striking force was operating beneath a frontal weather system that covered the area with intermittent overcast, rain squalls, and visibility that dropped to 2 to 5 miles in the heavier precipitation. The contrast was not subtle. It was the difference between standing in a floodlit arena and standing behind a curtain. Shōkaku and Zuikaku had, by pure meteorological chance, acquired a defensive advantage that no admiral had planned, and no intelligence officer had predicted. The weather front lay across the Coral Sea like a boundary, clear and exposed on the American side, murky and concealed on the Japanese side. Approximately 15,000 square miles of atmospheric shielding separated the two forces. The Japanese carriers were hiding behind a weather system the size of a small European country. Both sides launched search aircraft at approximately the same time, around 0600, and both sides found each other at approximately the same time, within 20 minutes of one another, between roughly 0820 and 0838. The parallel timing created a condition that neither side wanted, but neither could avoid: simultaneous strikes. Both the Japanese and the American strike groups would be airborne at the same time, heading in opposite directions. Neither side could recall its attack to strengthen its defense without conceding the initiative entirely. Both sides had to attack and defend simultaneously, dividing their air groups between the outbound strike and the combat air patrol left behind to protect the carriers. It was, in effect, a mutual exchange of blows, with no ability to block. Fletcher, upon receiving the contact report locating the Japanese carriers, faced a decision that had to be made in minutes. He could launch immediately with whatever was ready, accepting that the strike would be piecemeal, with Yorktown's and Lexington's air groups launching and proceeding independently. Or he could delay to coordinate a single, concentrated strike from both carriers, which would be more powerful, but would take 30 to 45 minutes longer to organize. The risk of delay was existential. If the Japanese strike arrived while American aircraft were still on the flight decks, being armed and fueled, the result would be the kind of catastrophe that would occur at Midway: bombs and torpedoes cooking off in hangars full of aviation gasoline. Fletcher chose to launch immediately. Both carriers began launching within minutes of receiving the contact report. The decision was correct, and its correctness would only become fully apparent weeks later at Midway, where the Japanese would face exactly the flight deck catastrophe that Fletcher's quick launch avoided. The strike coordination, such as it was, reflected the limitations of 1942 carrier communications. Yorktown's air group, under Commander William Birch, launched first and proceeded independently toward the Japanese position. Lexington's air group launched separately and followed a slightly different heading. The two groups would arrive over the target area at different times, separated by perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, reducing the concentrated effect of the attack. Carrier strike coordination, getting aircraft from multiple carriers to arrive over the same target at the same moment, was a tactical art that neither the American nor the Japanese Navy had mastered in May of 1942. It required precise timing, compatible navigation, reliable communications, and a degree of pre-mission planning that the urgency of the morning didn't permit. What launched from Yorktown and Lexington on the morning of the 8th was not a coordinated strike. It was two separate strikes, heading in roughly the same direction, and hoping to find the same target. I have to be honest about something here, because it affects how this entire chapter, and the two that follow it, should be understood. The weather advantage that protected the Japanese carriers on the morning of the 8th was pure chance. No commander planned it, no intelligence system predicted it, no tactical maneuver created it. A cold front happened to be in the right place at the right time to give one side concealment and deny it to the other. And yet, this meteorological accident may have been the single most consequential factor of the 8th of May. It made the Japanese carriers harder to find, harder to concentrate against, and easier to lose in the squalls during an attack run. It left the American carriers naked under clear skies, with nowhere to maneuver except into open water. This bothers me as a historian, because it means the outcome was partly determined by something utterly outside human control. Not courage, not planning, not intelligence, not seamanship, but the arbitrary position of a weather system on a given morning. The narrative wants to be about decisions. The evidence says it was partly about clouds. The exact position and density of the frontal weather has itself been a matter of debate. The official United States Navy assessment places the front directly over the Japanese force, suggesting solid overcast that would explain the difficulty American strike aircraft had in locating and attacking the carriers. Japanese accounts acknowledge cloud cover, but describe it as patchy, broken enough to operate aircraft through, but dense enough to maneuver into for evasion during an attack. The distinction matters operationally. Solid cover suggests the Japanese carriers were passively protected by luck. Patchy cover suggests they actively used rain squalls for evasive maneuvering, threading between clear patches and cloud banks to break the aim of attacking aircraft. The difference is between luck and skill, between passive advantage and active exploitation of terrain. The records don't fully resolve the question, and I suspect both elements were present. The weather provided the opportunity, and the Japanese ship handlers, who were excellent, exploited it. On the American side, there was no such opportunity. Yorktown and Lexington steamed under an open sky, with visibility measured in tens of miles. The Japanese search plane that found them would have had no difficulty fixing their position, tracking their course and speed, and reporting an accurate contact that would guide the inbound Japanese strike directly to the target. The Americans would have to defend without concealment, relying entirely on their combat air patrol, their anti-aircraft guns, and their ship handling to survive whatever the Japanese threw at them. The asymmetry was stark and simple. The Americans had to attack an enemy they could barely see, while the Japanese had to attack an enemy they couldn't miss. Fletcher briefly considered delaying his launch to combine both carriers' air groups into a single coordinated wave, but the risk calculus was unambiguous. The Japanese strike was almost certainly already airborne. Every minute spent organizing a more concentrated American strike was a minute closer to Japanese bombs, arriving over American flight decks, crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The memory of Pearl Harbor, where aircraft lined up on aprons had been destroyed by the score, was barely 5 months old. Fletcher's decision to launch immediately, accepting the penalty of an uncoordinated attack, was a trade. Less offensive power in exchange for less defensive vulnerability. He traded punch for survival. Given what was coming and what he couldn't yet see on any radar scope, it was the right trade. The strikes were airborne, both of them, heading in opposite directions across 200 miles of coral sea, with the weather front hanging between them like a curtain. On one side of the curtain, the American carriers waited under clear skies, their combat air patrol orbiting above, their anti-aircraft batteries manned, their damage control teams standing by. On the other side, the Japanese carriers maneuvered beneath cloud cover, their own combat air patrol aloft, their own strike inbound toward the American position. The next 2 hours would determine the outcome of the battle, and, through chains of consequence that neither side could yet foresee, the shape of the Pacific War for months to come. The readiness boards on all 4 carriers had been updated one final time. The numbers were what they were, and the aircraft, launched into the morning, were beyond recall. Chapter 9. Scratch 2 Flat Tops. Almost. The American strike arrived over the Japanese carrier force at approximately 10:57 on the morning of the 8th of May, and the first thing the pilots saw was weather, not carriers, cloud. The frontal system that had been shielding Takagi's force extended across the attack area in banks of cumulus and rain squalls, broken by patches of clear air through which the ocean was visible in fragments. A stretch of dark blue water here, a white wake there, then cloud again. Yorktown's air group, arriving first, had to search for the carriers visually through this broken ceiling, circling, descending, looking for the flat shapes of flight decks between the cloud layers. Coordination, already compromised by the separate launches, fragmented further as individual squadrons and divisions found different gaps in the weather and began their attacks piecemeal. The concentrated, simultaneous strike that doctrine called for, dive bombers from above, torpedo planes from the surface, fighters suppressing anti-aircraft fire, all arriving within the same 60-second window, was impossible under these conditions. What the Japanese weather shield produced was a dispersed, sequential attack, with American aircraft arriving in ones and twos, and small groups over a period of approximately 20 minutes. They found Shōkaku first. The larger of the 2 fleet carriers was steaming at high speed, her wake a broad white V on the dark water, visible through gaps in the overcast. SBD. Dauntlesses from Yorktown's bombing and scouting squadrons began their dives from altitude, pushing over into the steep 60 to 70 degree attack angle that the dive bombing doctrine prescribed. Shōkaku's captain ordered hard turns, and the carrier heeled into evasive maneuvers. Sharp course changes timed to the dive bomber's commitment point, the moment in the dive when the pilot could no longer adjust his aim. Anti-aircraft fire came up from the carrier and her escorts, a mix of the 127mm dual-purpose guns and the lighter 25mm automatic weapons that formed the close-in defense. 3 bombs hit. 3 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs from SBD Dauntlesses struck Shōkaku's flight deck. The damage pattern was specific and consequential. The first bomb hit the forward flight deck near the bow, blasting a crater in the wooden deck surface and severing the forward section of the flight deck from operational use. The The second struck the starboard side amidships, near the island's superstructure, starting fires in the upper hangar and killing personnel in the island compartments. The third hit the aft flight deck near the arresting gear, the wires that caught returning aircraft. Each hit, individually, was survivable. Shōkaku was a 32,000-ton warship with extensive compartmentalization and trained damage control teams. She was not going to sink from 3 bomb hits, but the cumulative effect on her flight deck was devastating. The forward deck was cratered. The aft arresting gear was damaged. Fires burned in the hangar spaces where aviation fuel lines ran beneath the deck planking. Within minutes of the last hit, Shōkaku was structurally intact, still steaming at speed, still afloat and stable, and completely unable to operate aircraft. No plane could launch from a cratered forward deck. No plane could land without functioning arresting gear. She was a carrier that could not carry. 108 of her crew were dead. 40 more were wounded. And she was, for every practical purpose of a carrier battle, out of the fight. Zuikaku, meanwhile, disappeared. The second Japanese fleet carrier, steaming in the same general area, drove into a rain squall and vanished from the American pilot's view. Aircraft from Lexington's air group, arriving over the target area 15 to 20 minutes after Yorktown's group, searched for the second carrier and couldn't find her. The weather that had shielded the Japanese force in general now shielded Zuikaku in particular, swallowing her into a bank of rain and cloud that no visual search could penetrate. American pilots from Lexington's strike claimed hits on a second carrier. Japanese records confirm that Zuikaku was not hit, not once. The discrepancy is a textbook case of combat overclaiming. Pilots attacking through anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, adrenaline flooding their perceptions, reporting explosions that were near misses or hits on escort ships as strikes on the carrier. Zuikaku's survival intact was not the result of superior ship handling or better defensive tactics, though both were adequate. It was the weather's gift, delivered free of charge. The damage control effort aboard Shōkaku was professional and, within its limits, successful. The fires were contained within approximately 2 hours. The ship was not in danger of sinking. Her engineering plant was undamaged. She could still steam at full speed. But the flight deck was wrecked. The unarmored design of the Shōkaku-class carriers, a deliberate pre-war trade-off, choosing higher aircraft capacity over deck protection, had made this outcome predictable. A 1,000-pound bomb detonating on or just below a wooden flight deck laid over steel beams created a blast crater roughly 6 to 9 meters in diameter, severed steam catapult lines and arresting cables, ruptured aviation fuel piping beneath the deck surface, and turned the immediate area into a burning, fragmented mess. An armored flight deck, like those on British carriers, which use 3-inch or thicker steel plating, could resist such hits, though at the cost of carrying fewer aircraft. The Japanese had chosen planes over protection. At Coral Sea, on the morning of the 8th, the cost of that choice was collected. Takagi ordered Shōkaku to withdraw. With no ability to launch or recover aircraft, she was not a combatant, but a liability. A large, valuable target, consuming escort resources while contributing nothing to the fight. Her surviving aircraft, those that had been airborne during the attack, flying as part of the strike against the American carriers or on combat air patrol, would have to land on Zuikaku. Zuikaku, already operating her own air group, was now responsible for recovering and servicing both carriers' aircraft. She was overcrowded, her deck crews working at a tempo that pushed toward the edge of safe operations, and the mathematics of attrition were tightening. Zuikaku was now the sole operational Japanese fleet carrier in the Coral Sea. Every aircraft lost, every pilot killed, every plane that returned too damaged to fly again, was a subtraction from a total that could not be replenished. To me, the standard narrative framing, the Americans failed to sink Shōkaku, misses the point so completely that it almost constitutes misinformation. They didn't need to sink her. They needed to remove her flight deck from the battle, and 3 bombs did exactly that. In carrier warfare, a carrier that cannot operate aircraft is not damaged. It is functionally dead. It occupies the same volume of ocean. It still displaces 32,000 tons. It still has a crew and engines and guns. But it cannot perform the single function that justifies its existence, launching and recovering aircraft. The American strike on the 8th of May achieved this functional kill with 3 hits out of perhaps 8 to 10 SBDs that actually scored. Those 3 bombs wouldn't show up impressively in a tonnage-sunk comparison. They didn't send Shōkaku to the bottom, but they sent her to the dockyards at Kure for 90 days of repair, consuming an estimated 2,800 tons of shipbuilding steel and materials, and they removed her, and by extension, Zuikaku's depleted air group, from the Midway operation 1 month later. 3 bombs at Coral Sea cost Japan 1/3 of the carrier force it could have brought to Midway. Shōkaku turned north and began her withdrawal, trailing smoke, her cratered flight deck open to the sky, her dead laid out below in whatever compartments the damage control teams had cleared. The fires were out, the ship was stable. The engineering plant thrummed at full power, pushing her through the water at 30+ knots as she opened the distance between herself and the enemy. She would reach Truk, then transit to Kure for repair. Her crew would spend 90 days in a dockyard while the war moved on without them. Some of those crew would never serve on a carrier again. The damage, 3 craters and a wooden deck, fires in a hangar, 108 dead, was, by the standards of the Pacific War, moderate. By the standards of what it cost, it was enormous. Behind her, Zuikaku recovered what aircraft she could. Some of the returning planes were damaged, holes in fuselages, hydraulic leaks, one engine trailing smoke. The deck crews on Zuikaku worked to turn them around, refuel, rearm, repair what could be repaired, push over the side what couldn't. The flight deck was crowded, the operational tempo was unsustainable, and the air group that had launched from 2 carriers that morning was now consolidated onto 1. A forced compression that degraded everything: maintenance access, arming schedules, launch and recovery cycles, the physical space available on the hangar deck to work on machines. Zuikaku was still fighting, but she was fighting with the accumulated burden of a 2-carrier air group crammed onto a single ship's infrastructure, and every hour that passed made that burden heavier. The Coral Sea to the south was empty now of Japanese fleet carriers operating as a strike force. Shōkaku was withdrawing. Zuikaku was operational, but strained. The American carriers were still out there, still afloat, and the Japanese strike that had launched simultaneously with the American one was, at that very moment, arriving over the American task force, under the clear, open skies that offered no concealment and no mercy. What happened to the American carriers during that same exchange is the subject of the next chapter. But the accounting for the Japanese side was already clear. 1 fleet carrier functionally killed, 1 light carrier sunk the day before, approximately 90 aircrew dead or missing across the operation's duration, and an invasion convoy steaming in circles north of the combat zone, waiting for an all-clear that would never come. Chapter 10. The Death of Lady Lex. On the morning of the 8th of May, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike, a mixed force of torpedo-armed B-5N Kates and bomb-armed D-3A Vals with A-6M0 escort, numbering approximately 69 aircraft, approached the American task force under the clear skies that the Coral Sea's weather had assigned to Fletcher's ships like a curse. Lexington and Yorktown were steaming roughly 3,000 yards apart, each surrounded by a screen of cruisers and destroyers, their combat air patrol aloft, and straining to identify the incoming raid on radar, the CXAM sets that both carriers carried, early war systems with limited resolution and no height-finding capability. The radar operators saw the contacts. The fighter directors vectored the Wildcats. But the intercept was imperfect. Too few fighters, too little altitude advantage, too many incoming aircraft spread across a wide approach sector. The Japanese strike, though smaller than the American strike had been, was better coordinated, arriving as a single formation that split into torpedo and dive bombing elements as it reached the American formation. Lexington was the primary target, and her size made her vulnerable. She was a converted battlecruiser hull, originally laid down in 1921 as CC-1, redesignated as CV-2, and her large turning radius, a legacy of that battlecruiser lineage, made her less agile than the purpose-built Yorktown. She needed more sea room and more time to complete evasive turns, and in the compressed minutes of a coordinated torpedo and dive bomb attack, time and sea room were exactly what she didn't have. The Japanese torpedo planes split into 2 groups, attacking from both bows in a classic anvil approach that forced Lexington to turn toward one group and expose her beam to the other. She took 2 torpedo hits on the port side. Simultaneously, dive bombers overhead pushed into their attacks, and 2 bombs struck, one forward, one amidships. The ship shuddered with each impact. The port torpedo hits opened the hull to the sea, flooding compartments and creating an immediate 7-degree list. The bomb hits started fires on the upper decks. Damage control teams moved with the trained efficiency that the pre-war Navy had drilled into them. The list was corrected by counterflooding, intentionally flooding starboard compartments to balance the ship. The fires were fought and contained. The engineering plant continued to function. By approximately noon, less than an hour after the attack, Lexington was operational. She was recovering aircraft. Her speed was maintained. Captain Frederick Sherman assessed the ship as damaged but survivable. The crisis, it appeared, had been managed. This was the cruelest moment of the entire battle, the false reprieve. Because deep inside Lexington's hull, in compartments that the damage control teams had not yet reached and could not yet see, something was happening that would kill the ship more thoroughly than any Japanese bomb or torpedo. The 2 torpedo hits on the port side had done more than open the hull to flooding. They had ruptured the aviation gasoline piping system that ran from Lexington's internal fuel storage tanks, located low in the hull, up through the ship to the flight deck fueling stations. Aviation gasoline, 100-octane avgas, is among the most dangerous substances carried aboard a warship. Its flash point is approximately -43°C, meaning it produces ignitable vapor at virtually any temperature found aboard a ship in the tropics. Its flammable range in air is between 1.4 and 7.6% by volume. A ruptured fuel line in an enclosed, unventilated compartment at tropical ambient temperatures would fill the space with explosive vapor in minutes, and that is exactly what was happening. Avgas was leaking from fractured piping into void spaces amidships, spaces that had lost ventilation when the torpedo hits disrupted the ship's electrical and mechanical systems. The vapor accumulated, silently, invisibly. The ship steamed on. Aircraft landed. The list was corrected. Everything seemed to be working. At 12:47, slightly more than an hour after the attack appeared to have been survived, a massive internal explosion tore through Lexington's midships section. The detonation was far larger than anything a Japanese bomb could have produced. It was avgas vapor, accumulated in an unventilated void, finding an ignition source, probably an electrical spark from a motor generator that had been left running, though the exact source has never been confirmed and went to the bottom with the ship. The explosion buckled bulkheads, started uncontrollable fires, and killed men in compartments that had been considered safe. More explosions followed as additional pockets of accumulated vapor ignited in sequence. Each explosion was a separate catastrophe, wrecking new compartments, starting new fires, overwhelming the damage control teams who were now fighting not a damaged ship, but a ship that was destroying itself from within. The Bureau of Ships Post-Loss Analysis, filed months later, based on survivor testimony and engineering reconstruction, identified the root cause with the dispassionate precision of engineers examining a failure they had predicted and failed to prevent. The avgas storage and distribution system aboard Lexington used piping that ran through multiple compartments, sealed with gaskets and mechanical couplings. Under normal conditions, the system was safe. Under the conditions created by 2 torpedo hits, hull deformation, shock damage to piping joints, loss of ventilation to surrounding spaces, the system became a delivery mechanism for explosive vapor. The pre-war Navy had known this vulnerability existed. They had experimented with carbon dioxide inerting systems, filling the void spaces around fuel tanks and piping with inert gas to prevent vapor accumulation. But the system had not been fully implemented on the older carriers. Lexington went to war with a known design flaw in her fuel system. The fix was understood. It simply wasn't installed in time. And on the afternoon of the 8th of May, the design flaw killed the ship. When I was reading the Bureau of Ships analysis alongside the survivor accounts, I found it difficult to maintain the historian's expected dispassion. The engineering reports are clinical. They describe failure modes, fracture points, vapor accumulation rates. They use phrases like probable ignition source and progressive structural failure. The survivor accounts describe men being blown off their feet by explosions in compartments they thought were safe, fires erupting from walls and deck seams, the smell of gasoline vapor spreading through passageways in the minutes before the first detonation. Several survivors recalled smelling avgas for 15 to 20 minutes before the explosion. They knew something was wrong, but the damage control organization was focused on the known damage, the torpedo holes and bomb craters, and the invisible threat accumulating in the void spaces wasn't detected until it announced itself with a blast that shook the entire ship. The gap between what the engineers knew was possible and what the ship's crew experienced is the space where 216 men died. Captain Sherman ordered abandoned ship at 17:07. The evacuation was remarkably orderly, a credit to the training and discipline of the crew and to the time available. Unlike ships that sank quickly, Lexington's slow death gave her crew hours to organize. Men descended ropes into the water. Destroyers and cruisers moved in close to pick up survivors. Personal effects were gathered where possible. The captain's dog was rescued. The juxtaposition of disciplined seamanship and absolute loss gives the evacuation a quality of surreal formality. Men following procedures for the last time, aboard a ship that was already dead but hadn't stopped floating. Of Lexington's crew of approximately 2,951, 2,735 were rescued. 216 were not. At 1956, the destroyer Phelps was ordered to scuttle Lexington with torpedoes. 5 torpedoes were required. The Lady Lex, 47,700 tons fully loaded, the largest warship sunk in action to that date, went down stern first, still burning, the fires visible on the horizon for hours after she slipped beneath the surface. The loss of Lexington was not simply a combat event. It was an engineering lesson purchased at the cost of 216 lives and 47,700 tons of irreplaceable warship. The avgas vapor vulnerability that killed her was immediately addressed in the surviving carriers. Emergency modifications, carbon dioxide flooding systems for void spaces, improved vapor detection equipment, redesigned fuel piping with additional isolation valves, were ordered for Yorktown and every other carrier in the fleet. Yorktown received emergency upgrades before Midway, upgrades that may have contributed to her surviving longer under attack at Midway than she would have otherwise. The dead of Lexington, in a grim and transactional sense, paid for the survival of men on other ships. The lesson was clear, specific, and technical. A carrier can survive the enemy's weapons and still be killed by her own fuel system if the design doesn't account for the secondary effects of combat damage. That lesson reshaped American carrier design and damage control doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. The Coral Sea closed over Lexington. The depth at the sinking position is over 2,500 meters. The ship settled through warm surface water, through the thermocline, into the cold and the dark and the pressure of the deep Pacific. The fires went out as the water rose. The hull groaned as the pressure increased. Somewhere in the wreckage, the motor generator that probably sparked the fatal explosion was still intact. Its serial number, its manufacturer's plate, its wiring, all descending into a darkness where no one would read them for decades. On the surface, the screening ships picked up the last swimmers. Oil spread in a great slick. The sun moved toward the horizon, and the task force, now one carrier lighter, turned away. Chapter 11. The Letter Home. Sometime before the 7th of May, 1942, the exact date isn't recorded, or if it was, it went down with the ship. A junior enlisted man aboard Lexington sat at a mess table and wrote a letter home. He wrote in pencil, on lined paper, the kind of stationery available from the ship's store, or distributed in bulk to crew who might not have brought their own. The handwriting tilted slightly to the right, the way handwriting does when someone is composing in a hurry or at an awkward angle, leaning over a table in a crowded compartment, while other men ate or played cards or slept in their chairs. The letter was ordinary. That's what matters about it. It wasn't a premonition of death or a profound meditation on mortality. It was the kind of letter that young men away from home have written in every war. Things are fine. The food is decent. The weather is hot. I expect to be home before too long. It was mailed at the last port call. It would arrive after the sender was either rescued or dead, carrying news from a world that had already ended. I should confess that I have held this letter, or rather, the idea of this letter, its type rather than its specific text, because I cannot confirm the exact contents of a particular document without direct archival access, for several chapters, waiting for the right moment. The temptation as a documentary maker is to open with it, to lead with the human interest, to use the emotional hook to draw the listener into a story that then pivots to strategy and logistics. but I think it means more here. After you've heard the fuel tables and the readiness rates and the tonnage figures, after you've sat through the damage control sequences and the vapor accumulation mechanics and the engineering analysis, now you know what those numbers weigh. A number like 216 dead is abstract until you've spent 10 chapters understanding the machinery that created it. And then it stops being a number and starts being 216 men who wrote letters like this one. The men of Lexington's Air Department, the pilots and air crew of the fighter, scouting, bombing, and torpedo squadrons, lived a particular rhythm aboard the carrier that was different from the ship's company. They existed in two worlds, the world of the ship, with its compartments and mess decks and bunk rooms, and the world of the air, with its cockpits and gun sights and the bottomless Pacific below. The transition between these worlds happened multiple times per day during operations, walking across the hangar deck in a flight suit, climbing into a cockpit that had been serviced by mechanics who lived in the ship world, launching off a deck that was simultaneously a workplace for the deck crew and a runway for the pilots. The torpedo squadron, VT2 aboard Lexington, occupied a particular position in this hierarchy because their aircraft, the TBD-1 Devastator, was the most dangerous ride on the ship. They knew it. Everyone knew it. The attack profile for a TBD carrying a Mark 13 torpedo has been described in technical terms in earlier chapters, but the human experience of flying that profile deserves its own reckoning. Every anti-aircraft gunner on the target ship knew exactly where the plane was going and exactly how fast. Every defending fighter knew it couldn't maneuver. 30 seconds of straight and level flight at 115 knots into concentrated defensive fire. The men who flew this profile weren't unaware of the arithmetic. They had calculated it themselves, in the way that professionals calculate risk, not with bravado, but with the cold clarity of experience. Before the battle, there was routine. Card games in the ready room, coffee from the galley, the particular boredom of a ship at sea between operations, when the days blur into a cycle of watches, meals, maintenance, and sleep. Letters were written during these intervals, not because anyone felt a special urgency, but because writing home was what you did. It was the thread that connected the world of the ship to the world you'd left behind. The letters went into the ship's mail system, were collected by the postal officer, and were sent ashore at the next port call, or transferred to a mail ship if one was available. The system was routine, efficient, and entirely one-directional. The writer sent the letter into the postal pipeline, and had no way of knowing when or if it would arrive. No way of amending or recalling it, no way of adding the postscript that subsequent events might demand. I don't have a specific individual's letter to read to you. I want to be clear about that. The collections at the National Museum of the Pacific War and the National Archives contain personal effects files associated with Lexington crewmen, letters, photographs, documents, and the type of letter I've described is consistent with hundreds of surviving examples from the period. But I will not invent a name, a hometown, or a specific quote and attribute it to a real person whose actual words I haven't verified. What I can tell you is that letters of this kind exist, that they were written by men who expected to come home, and that some of those men did not come home. The gap between the letter's expectation and the writer's fate is not a dramatic device. It is the fundamental condition of wartime correspondence. Every letter is written from a present tense that the recipient will read in a different future than the writer imagined. The evacuation of Lexington on the afternoon of the 8th was, by all accounts, conducted with a discipline that speaks to the quality of the crew. Men lined up. They slid down ropes into the water. They swam to the screening destroyers and cruisers that had moved in close to pick up survivors. Some men went back aboard to retrieve personal items, photographs, letters, small objects that connected them to lives elsewhere. The ship was still afloat, still level enough to walk on, the fires burning in her midship section, but not yet engulfing the whole vessel. There was time. The orderliness of the evacuation, the fact that 2,735 out of approximately 2,951 crewmen were rescued, reflects both good seamanship and the slow pace of Lexington's dying. She took hours to die. The avgas explosions were progressive, not instantaneous. Men had time to gather, to organize, to help the wounded. The rescue was real. So were the 216 who didn't make it. Men caught in the explosions, trapped in flooded compartments, or killed by the initial torpedo and bomb hits before the evacuation began. Many of the survivors were immediately reassigned. There was no pause, no decompression period, no assessment of what we would now call post-traumatic stress. The war needed trained sailors. It needed experienced carrier crewmen. It needed pilots and mechanics and radar operators. And the men who had just watched their ship die were precisely those men. Some Lexington survivors were back in combat within weeks. Some were at Midway less than a month later, assigned to other ships, other air groups, carrying the memory of the 8th of May into a new battle before the old one had finished settling in their minds. The Navy of 1942 did not have a framework for understanding the psychological cost of what these men had experienced. The concept of moral injury, the damage done by witnessing or participating in events that violate one's moral expectations, was decades away from formal recognition. The men were simply reassigned. The letters they had written before the battle arrived at homes across America in the days and weeks that followed, carrying the ordinary words of men who had expected to be fine. The mess table where the letter was written is at the bottom of the Coral Sea now, resting in the wreckage of Lexington at a depth of over 2,500 meters. The pencil, the lined paper, the ship's store stationery, all of it dissolved into the particular democracy of the deep ocean, where admirals' furniture and enlisted men's letters decompose at the same rate in the same cold darkness. What survives is the letter itself, the one that was mailed, the one that traveled through the postal system and arrived at a house or an apartment in a town somewhere in America, where someone opened it and read the ordinary words, and then received, days or weeks later, a telegram from the Navy Department that made the ordinary words extraordinary. The letter became the last thing, the last direct communication from a person who had been alive and writing and expecting to come home. The weight of that transformation, from routine correspondence to sacred object, is not something a tonnage figure or a readiness table can capture, but it is part of the cost. And any accounting of the Battle of the Coral Sea that omits it is incomplete. The sea above Lexington's grave is indistinguishable from the sea anywhere else in the Coral Sea. Blue, warm, deep, moved by the same currents and winds that moved it in May of 1942. Ships pass over the site routinely. Most of them don't know they're passing over a grave. The letter, wherever it ended up, a family Bible, a shoebox in a closet, a donation to a museum archive, carries the date and the handwriting and the ordinariness of a moment that preceded everything. And the man who wrote it, whoever he was, did not write it as a historical document or a piece of evidence. He wrote it because that's what you did. You wrote home. You said things were fine. And then you went back to work. Chapter 12. Yorktown's Wounds. The Repair That Changed Midway. Yorktown took a single bomb hit on the morning of the 8th of May, 1942. One bomb, a 250-kilogram semi-armor-piercing weapon, dropped by a D-3A Val dive bomber from the Japanese carrier strike, penetrated the flight deck and detonated deep inside the ship, on the 4th deck level, in a region housing crew compartments and storage spaces. The explosion killed 66 men. It buckled frame members across a section roughly 9 meters wide. It ruptured compartments on 3 deck levels, creating a hole in the ship's internal structure that compromised watertight integrity and weakened the hull's longitudinal strength. Fires started and were fought. Damage control teams shored up buckled frames with timbers and steel braces. The ship remained operational. She could still steam, still launch and recover aircraft, still fight. But she was hurt. The structural damage was real, and it would matter. Not here, at Coral Sea, where Yorktown continued to operate for the remainder of the engagement. It would matter 3 weeks later, at a place called Midway, where the same area of the ship would be struck again. Yorktown withdrew from the Coral Sea and began the long transit back to Pearl Harbor, steaming northeast across the Pacific, with temporary repairs and a diminished air group. The ship arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May. Her engineering officers conducted a damage assessment. Their conclusion? 90 days minimum for full structural repair. 90 days. That would make Yorktown unavailable until late August. The Midway operation, which Nimitz, based on continued hypo-intelligence, expected in early June, was less than 10 days away. 90 days was not an option. Nimitz boarded Yorktown personally to inspect the damage. He walked the damaged compartments. He saw the buckled frames, the temporary shores, the patched bulkheads. And he told the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard commander what he needed. 3 days, not 90. 3. The Pearl Harbor Navy Yard mobilized 1,400 workers. They worked around the clock, 3 shifts, continuous, no breaks except for physical necessity. Welders, ship fitters, pipe fitters, electricians, riggers, structural steel workers. They cut out damaged frame sections and welded in new steel plate. They reinforced the most critically compromised structural members. They restored watertight integrity to compartments that had been open to flooding. They replated deck sections. They tested, or attempted to test, the repairs under the time constraints available. The work was not elegant. It was not the kind of repair that a dockyard superintendent would sign off on under peacetime standards. It was emergency surgery. Stabilize the patient, close the wound, get them back on their feet. The quality of the underlying repair was sufficient for service, not optimal for longevity. Yorktown would go to Midway patched, but not healed, structurally sound enough to operate, but weaker than she had been, carrying the damage from Coral Sea forward like an old fracture that might hold, or might not. The repair consumed approximately 350 tons of steel plate and structural material. The labor investment was staggering. 1,400 workers multiplied by 72 hours of continuous operations equals roughly 100,800 man-hours. 100,000 man-hours to repair the damage from a single 250-kilogram bomb. That ratio, the cost of repair versus the cost of damage, is the arithmetic of modern industrial warfare, and it always favors the attacker. A bomb that costs a fraction of a ton to manufacture and deliver requires hundreds of tons of material and 100,000 hours of labor to repair. The asymmetry is structural. The only counter is industrial capacity, the ability to absorb the cost of repair faster than the enemy can inflict damage. In May of 1942, the United States had that capacity. The Pearl Harbor Navy Yard had the workers, the steel, the tools, and the institutional will to execute a repair that the damage assessment said was impossible in the time available. They did it anyway. The workers who performed this repair were not, in the main, the uniformed sailors and officers who feature in the battle narratives. They were civilian employees of the Navy Yard, a workforce that reflected the demographic reality of wartime Oahu. Native Hawaiian, Japanese American, Filipino American, Portuguese American, and mainland haole workers labored side by side in the dry dock and aboard the ship. Some of these men had repaired damage from the December 7th attack. Some had worked on ships that had been pulled from the mud of Battleship Row. They knew what bomb damage looked like. They knew how to cut away warped steel and weld in new plate. Their skill was manual, physical, specific. The skill of hands that had gripped welding torches and rivet guns for years. Their contribution to Yorktown's repair, and therefore to the Battle of Midway, is almost entirely absent from the standard historical narrative, which moves directly from Yorktown was repaired in 72 hours to Yorktown arrived at Midway, as if the repair were a plot device rather than a feat of industrial labor performed by identifiable human beings. I believe the 1,400 shipyard workers who repaired Yorktown in 72 hours deserve to be listed alongside the pilots and gunners of Midway in whatever accounting of the Pacific War's decisive contributors we choose to maintain. Without their work, their welding torches, their steel plate, their sleepless 72-hour shifts, there would have been no third carrier at Midway. Enterprise and Hornet would have faced 4 Japanese carriers alone, 2 against 4. The arithmetic of that engagement would have been different, and the outcome might have been very different. Yorktown's air group at Midway, a composite group hastily assembled from Yorktown survivors and squadrons borrowed from Saratoga, would score hits on the Japanese carrier Hiryu. The ship that the Japanese believed they had sunk at Coral Sea would appear off Midway like a ghost and deliver blows that contributed to the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. All of it traced back to the dry dock at Pearl Harbor, and the 1,400 workers who turned 90 days into 3. Yorktown's air group from Midway was itself a product of Coral Sea's attrition. The original air group had been depleted by the battle, aircraft lost, pilots killed or wounded, machines worn out. The reconstituted group mixed survivors from Yorktown's Coral Sea air group with squadrons from Saratoga, which was on the west coast, undergoing repair from a torpedo hit. These squadrons had never operated together as a unit. They had different communication procedures, different tactical habits, different relationships between the pilots and the ship's operations staff. The composite air group was a forced improvisation, better than having no air group at all, but less effective than a unit that had trained and flown together for months. This degradation of unit cohesion was another downstream cost of Coral Sea, invisible on any chart of ships sunk or aircraft destroyed, but real in the reduced effectiveness of the composite group at Midway. The question that the 72-hour repair leaves unresolved, and that Midway would partially answer, is whether the repair was enough. The structural reinforcement addressed the most critical damage, but left the underlying hull in a weakened state in the area of the Coral Sea bomb hit. At Midway, on the 4th of June, a Japanese bomb would strike Yorktown in approximately the same area. The earlier damage may have compromised the ship's structural integrity in that zone, making the second hit more devastating than it would have been against an undamaged hull. Whether the Coral Sea damage contributed to Yorktown's eventual loss at Midway is debated but unprovable. The second attack was severe enough that even an undamaged ship might not have survived. What is clear is that Yorktown went to Midway carrying the scars of Coral Sea, and those scars were a factor. How large a factor remains a matter for engineering analysis and historical argument. The dry dock at Pearl Harbor emptied. Yorktown backed out, her hull wet with new paint over new welds, her repaired compartments smelling of fresh steel and welding flux. She headed to sea to rendezvous with Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. The date was approximately the 30th of May, 1942. The Battle of Midway would begin on the 4th of June. Yorktown had less than a week of life remaining. She would be hit on the 4th, hit again on the 4th, and finally torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on the 6th, sinking on the 7th of June. Her service life after the Coral Sea repair was measured in days, but those days contained the battle that broke the Japanese carrier force. And the repair that gave Yorktown those days was performed by 1,400 workers, whose names, for the most part, history has not recorded. The welding torches went out, the dry dock pumps shut down, the last scaffolding was removed, and Yorktown, her flight deck whole again, her compartments sealed, her frames reinforced with steel that still smelled of the forge, turned her bow toward the open Pacific, and headed for a battle that would be decided, in part, by whether 350 tons of new steel plate and 100,000 man-hours of labor could hold together under the impact of weapons that hadn't been designed to be survived. The question went with her, unanswered, into the blue water. Chapters 13 through 17 to follow. Next 5 chapters. Approximately 2,000 words per chapter. 10 paragraphs. Each paragraph around 3 to 4 sentences. Chapter 13. The Invasion That Never Came. On the afternoon of the 7th of May, 1942, a signal was transmitted from 4th Fleet Headquarters at Withdrawal to the 11 transports of the Port Moresby invasion convoy, then steaming south through the Solomon Sea under Rear Admiral Koso Abe's command. The signal, as reconstructed in Volume 49 of the Senshi Sosho, was brief and operational. Temporarily retire northward. The convoy, 72,000 gross register tons of transports, carrying 5,500 troops, their equipment, their ammunition, and the entire purpose of Operation MO, reversed course. The word temporarily carried the weight of an assumption that events would improve. They did not. The order came from Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commanding the 4th Fleet from Rabaul, and his reasoning was straightforward. Shōhō, the light carrier providing close air cover for the convoy, had just been sunk. The American carrier force, at least one fleet carrier confirmed, possibly 2, was operational and in the Coral Sea, positioned between the convoy and its destination. Without air cover, the invasion transports were defenseless against carrier airstrikes. 11 transports at 11 knots, in open water, under clear skies, with no air umbrella, would be a slaughter. Inoue understood this with a clarity that some of his superiors, 2,000 miles away at Combined Fleet Headquarters, did not seem to share. The retirement was supposed to be temporary, pending the outcome of the carrier battle on the 8th of May. If Takagi's carriers destroyed the American force, air superiority would be restored, and the convoy could resume its southward transit. If the carrier battle was inconclusive or unfavorable, the invasion would need to be reassessed. Inoue waited. The 8th of May came and went. The carrier battle produced results that were, depending on how you measured them, either a Japanese tactical success or an operational stalemate. Lexington was sunk, a major American loss, but Shōkaku was crippled and withdrawing. Yorktown was damaged but still operational. Zuikaku was intact, but her air group was badly depleted. The American carrier force had not been destroyed. It had been hurt, but it was still there. On the evening of the 8th, Inoue made the decision that would define the battle's strategic outcome. The Port Moresby invasion was postponed indefinitely. Not cancelled in so many words, the bureaucratic language of military commands avoids the finality of cancellation when possible, but postponed with no new date set, which amounted to the same thing. His assessment was that the remaining carrier air strength, Zuikaku alone, with depleted air groups, was insufficient to provide the sustained air cover that an amphibious landing required. An amphibious landing in 1942 meant transports anchored in a roadstead for 24 to 48 hours, while troops and equipment were offloaded by boat. During that period, the transports were stationary. Every hour in the anchorage was an hour of vulnerability that only air superiority could mitigate. Without it, the landing was suicide. Inoue understood this calculus. He chose not to gamble with it. Combined Fleet Headquarters, under Admiral Yamamoto at Truk, disagreed. The reaction from Yamamoto's staff, as recorded in Chief of Staff Ugaki Matome's diary, published posthumously as Fading Victory, was frustration bordering on contempt. Ugaki's entry notes the sinking of Lexington with satisfaction, and implies that Inoue should have pressed the invasion while the Americans were weakened. The view from Truk was that the carrier battle had been won. 2 American carriers sunk in their assessment, and that the opportunity to take Port Moresby was being squandered by an overly cautious subordinate. The view from Withdrawal, where Inoue had direct communication with Takagi's force and a clearer picture of the actual damage sustained, was different. Inoue knew Shōkaku was out of action. He knew Zuikaku's air group was depleted. He knew the Americans still had at least one operational carrier. The information asymmetry between Withdrawal and Truk, between the man with the operational picture and the men with the strategic ambition, produced a command disagreement that would never be formally resolved. It fascinates me that Inoue is so consistently treated as a failure in the conventional narrative, because when I examine his actual decision against the available evidence, he was the only Japanese flag officer in the entire MO operation who correctly understood the relationship between the carrier battle and the invasion. Takagi fought the carrier battle. Hara directed the air operations. But Inoue was the man responsible for the operation's objective, the seizure of Port Moresby. And he was the only one who grasped that sinking an enemy carrier didn't matter if you couldn't land your troops safely. He was relieved of command after Coral Sea and spent the rest of the war in administrative positions, eventually heading the Naval Academy. His vindication came only in post-war analysis, decades too late to matter to him personally. The 5,500 troops of the South Seas Detachment returned to Rabaul. Their transports anchored in Simpson Harbor, the volcanic caldera filling again with the ships that had emptied from it days before. The soldiers disembarked. The equipment was offloaded. The entire logistical effort of the embarkation, the loading, the manifesting, the coordination of ship space and unit assignments, was reversed. The fuel consumed by the round trip was gone. The operational wear on the transports, engine hours, hull stress, the incremental degradation of machinery, was spent for nothing. 72,000 tons of shipping had sailed from Rabaul and returned to Rabaul without putting a single soldier ashore at the objective. The troops who came back to Rabaul would not sit idle. They were eventually committed to the overland advance on Port Moresby via the Kokoda Track, a jungle trail over the Owen Stanley Range that would become one of the most grueling ground campaigns of the Pacific War. The overland route was attempted because the seaborne route had failed. The Kokoda campaign would itself fail, stopped by Australian defenders and the logistical impossibility of supplying an army over a mountain trail through equatorial jungle. Port Moresby never fell. The base that was the objective of the entire MO operation remained in Allied hands throughout the war. It became a staging point for the Allied counteroffensive in New Guinea, a base from which aircraft struck Japanese positions across the Bismarck archipelago. The thing Japan had tried to take became the thing that helped take everything back. To me, the most important sentence in any assessment of the Battle of the Coral Sea is this one: Operation MO failed. The invasion was the purpose. The carrier battle was the means. The means produced ambiguous results. One carrier lost on each side, roughly, depending on how you count Shōhō. But the purpose was unambiguous. Port Moresby was not taken. The invasion convoy turned around. 5,500 troops went back to where they started. Measured against the operation's stated objective, there is no version of this outcome that constitutes a Japanese success. You can argue about carrier exchange ratios. You can debate whether the Americans or the Japanese performed better in the air combat. But you cannot argue that Operation MO achieved its goal, because it didn't. The objective was a piece of ground, and the ground stayed in Allied hands. The harbor at Rabaul settled back into its operational routine. The transports swung at anchor. The volcanic rim muted the sound of the open sea, and somewhere in the filing systems of 4th Fleet headquarters, the operational order for MO, with its precise timetables, its 5-pronged convergence plan, its assumption of surprise, was archived. Not marked as cancelled, not stamped with a failure assessment, simply filed, as the bureaucracy of war files everything, alongside the next operation order and the one after that. The word temporarily in the retirement signal was never amended. The temporary retirement became permanent through the simple mechanism of never being reversed. And the 11 transports, empty now, their holds echoing where 5,500 soldiers had been, waited in the caldera for whatever came next. Chapter 14. The Air Crew Ledger. Japan's Irreplaceable Losses. In the reference work, Japanese Naval Aces and Fighter Units in World War II, compiled by Ikuhiko Hata and Yasuho Izawa, and published in English translation in 1989, there is a roster of pilots assigned to Shōkaku and Zuikaku's air groups in the spring of 1942. The roster includes annotations, small, factual notes next to each name recording what happened to them. The annotations are a casualty list in miniature. KIA 7 May, Missing 7 May, Twilight Mission. KIA 8 May, Wounded 8 May, died of wounds. When you cross-reference this roster with the air group strength tables in the Senshi Sosho, the aggregate emerges. Carrier Division 5's air groups lost approximately 90 air crew killed or missing during the Coral Sea operation. That number, 90, is the hidden wound of the battle, the loss that didn't show up on any ship-sinking tally, but that bled forward into Midway and beyond. The men on that roster were not ordinary pilots. They were among the most experienced carrier aviators in the world. The average flight hours for combat pilots in Carrier Division 5's air groups exceeded 800, a figure that represented years of peacetime training, qualification flights, formation practice, weapon delivery drills, and combat operations at Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, and the Indian Ocean. 800 flight hours is a substantial accumulation of skill. It represents not just the ability to fly an aircraft, but the instinctive judgment that comes from thousands of repetitions, the ability to assess a target in seconds, to adjust a dive angle by feel, to navigate back to a carrier through weather without conscious calculation. This expertise was embodied. It lived in the pilot's hands and eyes and nervous systems, and when those pilots died, it died with them. The training pipeline that produced these men was designed for a different war than the one they were fighting. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot training program, the Yokarin system for enlisted aviators, the Naval Academy track for officers, was built on a philosophy of extreme selectivity. Candidates entered a multi-year program that washed out approximately 90% of entrants. The survivors emerged as superb individual aviators, capable of feats of airmanship that their Allied counterparts often couldn't match in the early war period. But the throughput was tiny. Pre-war, the pipeline produced approximately 100 fully carrier-qualified pilots per year. 100. The entire annual output of the system wouldn't replace the losses from a single major engagement. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. Lose 90 experienced aircrew at Coral Sea. Produce 100 replacement pilots per year. The replacement rate barely exceeded the loss rate from a single battle, and the war was producing battles at a pace of one every few weeks. By mid-1942, the training pipeline was beginning to accelerate, but acceleration in pilot training doesn't mean turning a dial. It means building new training facilities, acquiring new training aircraft, assigning experienced pilots as instructors, pulling them from combat units, which further depletes the frontline force. Every instructor assigned to the training pipeline was a pilot not flying combat missions. The Japanese were caught in a structural trap. The faster they tried to replace losses, the more they weakened the force generating those losses. The contrast with the American training system is the contrast between two theories of war. The Japanese system assumed a short, decisive conflict, in which a small number of supremely skilled pilots would win quick victories before attrition became a factor. The American system, especially after December of 1941, was designed for a long war of attrition in which quantity would eventually overwhelm quality. The U.S. Navy's wartime pilot training expansion sacrificed some individual pilot quality for volume, processing far more candidates through a shorter but still rigorous program. By 1943, the American pipeline would be producing thousands of qualified naval aviators per year. The Japanese pipeline, even at its wartime maximum, never approached this output. The two systems reflected the two nations' fundamental strategic assumptions, and the Coral Sea was the first battle where the assumptions were tested. The American losses at Coral Sea, approximately 35 to 40 aircrew killed or missing, were painful but absorbable within a system that was scaling exponentially. The Japanese losses were a wound that would never fully heal. I find the language of human capital distasteful when applied to individual lives, and I use it here deliberately because that distaste is the point. The Japanese High Command did think in these terms: experienced pilots as investments, training hours as assets on a balance sheet. They had to. Any military organization must account for the cost of producing the specialized personnel who operate its most complex systems. But here is the damning thing. Even within their own framework, even thinking of pilots as assets rather than people, the Japanese command failed to protect the asset base. The MO operation committed 1/3 of Japan's fleet carrier capability to a secondary objective with a rigid timetable and no margin for error. The twilight mission of the 7th, Hara's Gamble, spent 9 aircraft and crews for 0 return. The May 8th strike, while damaging Yorktown, cost aircraft and pilots that the pipeline couldn't replace. The total expenditure of approximately 90 irreplaceable aircrew for an operation that failed to achieve its objective was, by any measure, including the cold, dehumanizing measure of human capital accounting, a catastrophic investment. The impact cascaded directly into Midway. Zuikaku's air group, after absorbing Shōkaku's survivors and accounting for the Coral Sea losses, was assessed by Combined Fleet as not combat-ready for the Midway operation. The assessment was a personnel judgment, not a mechanical one. Zuikaku's hull was undamaged. Her engineering plant was fully functional. She could steam, she could launch aircraft, she could fight. But her reconstituted air group, a patchwork of survivors from both carriers, missing roughly 40% of its experienced pilots, lacked the unit cohesion and individual skill level that carrier operations demanded. You cannot assemble a carrier air group like a parts bin, swapping one pilot for another as if they were interchangeable components. Pilots who have trained together, flown together, and fought together develop an implicit coordination that no amount of individual skill can replace. That coordination was shattered by the Coral Sea losses. There was another asymmetry, less often noted, that amplified the Japanese personnel losses: rescue capability. The American task force had screening destroyers tasked with rescuing downed aircrew, a combat search and rescue function that, while primitive by modern standards, gave a ditched American pilot a reasonable chance of recovery if he went down near the task force. The Japanese had no equivalent systematic rescue capability. A Japanese pilot who ditched in the Coral Sea, from fuel exhaustion, combat damage, or navigation error, had an essentially 0 chance of being picked up. The 9 aircrew lost in the twilight mission of the 7th, for example, included men who successfully ditched their aircraft on the water, but were never found. They died not because they couldn't survive the landing, but because nobody came to look for them. This asymmetry meant that every engagement cost the Japanese proportionally more in irreplaceable personnel than it cost the Americans, not because the Japanese fought worse, but because their losses were more final. The Senshi Sosho records the Coral Sea aircrew losses with the characteristic factual density of Japanese official history: names, units, dates, circumstances where known. The annotations are sparse. There is no emotional commentary, no assessment of what the losses meant in human terms. The official history counts. It does not mourn. And the numbers it counts: 90 aircrew from Carrier Division 5, representing approximately 72,000 cumulative flight hours of experience, would echo forward through the remaining months of the Pacific War. At Midway, less than a month later, The Japanese carrier force would lose over 200 additional aircrew. By the end of 1942, the elite cadre of pre-war trained carrier pilots that had made the Kido Butai the most formidable naval aviation force in the world would be functionally extinct. The roster in Hata and Izawa's book is a document of a particular kind, not a battle map or a tonnage table, but a list of names with dates of death attached. The names are Japanese, family names first, given names second, in the convention of the language. Each name represents a man who had spent years learning to fly, to fight, to land on a carrier deck in conditions that tested the limits of human skill. Each annotation, KIA, missing, died of wounds, represents the end of that accumulated expertise. The roster doesn't tell you what they looked like, what letters they wrote home, what they thought about on the morning of the 7th or the 8th of May. It tells you they existed, and then they didn't. And the training pipeline that was supposed to replace them was producing 100 pilots a year, into a war that was consuming them by the hundreds. Chapter 15. How Tokyo Scored It. The Intelligence Failure After Victory. In the diary of Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto at Combined Fleet Headquarters, the entry for the 8th of May, 1942, records the initial assessment of the Coral Sea battle with something approaching satisfaction. 2 American carriers, a Saratoga type and a Yorktown type, had been sunk, according to the reports received from Takagi's force. The claim of a Saratoga type was correct. Lexington, which was indeed a large carrier of roughly similar displacement, had been sunk. The claim that Yorktown had been sunk was wrong. Yorktown was damaged, not sunk. She was steaming under her own power toward Pearl Harbor, but Ugaki recorded both sinkings as fact. Combined Fleet planned its next operation on this basis, and the next operation was Midway. The error originated in the standard pilot debriefing process aboard the Japanese carriers. Returning aviators from the 8th of May strike reported attacking 2 carriers and scoring hits on both. In the chaos of a multi-aircraft attack through anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception, multiple pilots claimed bomb and torpedo hits on what they believed were 2 separate targets. The debriefing officers, working under time pressure to compile results for the task force commander, aggregated these individual claims into a summary assessment. 2 carriers hit, both assessed as sunk. The aggregation amplified the individual overclaims. Each pilot reported what he believed he saw, and the sum of these honest but inaccurate individual observations produced a group conclusion that was significantly divorced from reality. The fundamental problem was not dishonesty. It was the structural unreliability of battle damage assessment derived from combat pilot reports. A pilot attacking a target at 300 knots through flak and fighter opposition has seconds, literally seconds, to observe the effect of his weapon before he has passed the target and evading. Smoke from a near miss looks identical to smoke from a direct hit when viewed from a departing aircraft. A torpedo detonation alongside a ship's hull produces a water column that obscures whether the torpedo actually struck the hull or exploded in the ship's wake. Multiple pilots attacking the same target from different angles independently claim what they believe are separate hits, when in fact they may be observing the same explosion from different perspectives. Post-war analysis of World War II carrier aviation BDA suggests an inflation factor of roughly 2 to 3 times, meaning that reported results were typically double or triple the actual results. The Japanese overclaiming at Coral Sea was consistent with this known error rate. The critical question, and one that historians have debated without resolution, is whether Combined Fleet genuinely believed both carriers were sunk, or whether doubt existed but was suppressed. Partial and Tully, in Shattered Sword, argue that the intelligence failure was genuine, that Combined Fleet staff accepted the pilot reports at face value because they had no mechanism for independent verification and no institutional habit of discounting combat claims. H.P. Wilmot, in The Barrier and the Javelin, published in 1983, is more skeptical, suggesting that institutional incentives, the desire to justify proceeding to Midway, may have influenced the assessment. The truth likely contains elements of both. The pilot reports were genuinely believed by most staff officers, and the few who harbored doubts had institutional reasons not to voice them loudly. The impact on Midway planning was direct and quantifiable. If 2 American carriers were sunk at Coral Sea, the United States Pacific Fleet had, at most, 2 fleet carriers remaining, Enterprise and Hornet. Yamamoto's Midway plan was predicated on a 4-carrier striking force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, facing 2 American carriers, 4 against 2, comfortable odds that allowed for the complex, multi-pronged operational design that Yamamoto favored. Carrier strikes on Midway Island itself, an invasion force, a diversionary thrust into the Aleutians. The plan had margins, or appeared to. In reality, the Americans would have 3 carriers at Midway, Enterprise, Hornet, and the repaired Yorktown, 4 against 3. The margin that the intelligence error had created was illusory, and when Yorktown appeared on the morning of the 4th of June, the Japanese were facing a force 1/3 stronger than they expected. It strikes me as unlikely that Yamamoto, who was, by all accounts, a careful strategic thinker with a gambler's instinct tempered by a mathematician's discipline, did not harbor some private doubt about the Coral Sea BDA. But I have no evidence for this doubt. What I have is Ugaki's diary recording certainty. What I have is the Midway operational plan built on that certainty. And what I have is the outcome: 4 Japanese carriers burning on the afternoon of the 4th of June, in part because the force they expected to fight was not the force they actually fought. The phantom of the intelligence error, the ghost of the sunk Yorktown, materialized off Midway with a flight deck and an air group and delivered blows that the Japanese had not planned for because they had been told the ship was at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The Japanese were not uniquely prone to this error. The Americans had the exact same BDA inflation problem. American pilots at Coral Sea claimed far more Japanese aircraft destroyed and ships damaged than actually occurred. The Tulagi strikes of the 3rd of May, for example, produced wildly inflated claims relative to actual damage. The difference was not in the accuracy of the claims, but in the strategic consequences of the errors. American overclaiming at Coral Sea didn't lead to a flawed operational plan. The American command didn't base its next major operation on the assumption that it had sunk carriers that were actually still afloat. The asymmetry of consequences, not the asymmetry of honesty, is what mattered. Both sides were equally wrong about their results. Only one side built a strategy on the wrongness. The Japanese naval culture that surrounded the assessment process amplified the error in ways that individual accuracy could not correct. The Imperial Japanese Navy's institutional culture discouraged subordinates from challenging superior assessments. Once combined fleet staff had accepted the 2 carriers sunk conclusion, questioning it became professionally hazardous. A staff officer who raised doubts would be challenging not just an intelligence assessment, but the judgment of his superiors, an act that, in the IJN's rigid hierarchical culture, carried career consequences. The cultural factor transformed a normal intelligence error, overclaiming, which all air forces committed in all theaters, into a strategic blind spot that persisted uncorrected into the planning and execution of the Midway operation. The diary entry stands. Ugaki's handwriting, or rather the handwriting of his diary as preserved and published, records the Coral Sea as a victory. 2 enemy carriers sunk, 1 Japanese light carrier lost, Shōkaku damaged but repairable. The exchange, in Ugaki's reckoning, favored Japan. The math supported this conclusion, if you accepted the premises. But the premises were wrong. Yorktown was not sunk. Yorktown was heading to Pearl Harbor. Yorktown would be repaired in 72 hours by 1,400 shipyard workers. Yorktown would appear off Midway with an air group and a patched flight deck and a hull full of new welds. And the strategic assumption built on a pilot's 5-second observation through anti-aircraft smoke, target sinking, would collapse on the morning of the 4th of June, with a speed and finality that no diary entry could prepare for. The intelligence error at Coral Sea was, in the end, a failure not of collection, but of assessment, not of gathering information, but of evaluating it honestly. The raw data, pilot reports, was the best available. The analysis, aggregation without discounting, was standard practice. The institutional culture, deference to authority, reluctance to voice doubt, was systemic. And the consequence, a strategic plan built on false premises, was catastrophic. The error didn't require malice. It didn't require stupidity. It only required the ordinary human tendency to believe the news you want to hear, amplified by an institutional structure that punished skepticism. That combination has produced intelligence failures in every war, in every era, and in every nation that has ever fought one. Chapter 16. The Ledger. Was Coral Sea a Japanese victory? In 1949, Samuel Eliot Morison published Volume 4 of his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, covering the Coral Sea, Midway, and submarine operations. His assessment of the Coral Sea battle opens with a formulation that would become canonical: a tactical victory for Japan, but a strategic victory for the Allies. The phrase entered the bloodstream of Pacific War historiography and has been repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and popular histories for over 7 decades. It has the satisfying shape of a balanced judgment. Each side gets something. The analysis appears even-handed. The reader is invited to nod at the complexity. But a formulation that survives for 70 years on the strength of its neatness deserves closer examination than neatness alone can justify. Morison's framework is not fact. It is an interpretive choice, and it was made by a man with institutional commitments that shaped his judgment. Morison's tactical defeat for the Allies rests primarily on the tonnage exchange. Japan sank approximately 49,000 tons of Allied warships, Lexington at 47,700 tons, Neosho at 7,383 tons, and Sims at roughly 2,100 tons, plus damage to Yorktown. The Allies sank approximately 12,000 tons of Japanese warships, Shōhō at 11,262 tons, plus significant damage to Shōkaku. By the raw numbers, tonnage sent to the bottom, Japan won by a ratio of approximately 4-1. This metric has the appeal of apparent objectivity. Tons are tons, ships are ships, the bigger number wins. But the metric is misleading because it treats all tons as equivalent when they aren't, and it measures the battle by a standard, tonnage sunk, that was relevant to the Battle of Jutland, but not to an engagement whose purpose was an amphibious invasion. In 1983, H.P. Wilmot published The Barrier and the Javelin, which challenged Morison's framework directly. Wilmot argued that Coral Sea was not merely a strategic consolation prize for the Allies, but a genuine Japanese operational failure, a defeat at every level except the ship exchange ratio. Wilmot's analysis focused on the operational design. The MO plan was rigid, the command structure was fractured, the intelligence assumptions were wrong, and the execution produced cascading errors that left the Japanese unable to achieve their objective. For Wilmot, the tonnage exchange was irrelevant noise. The only metric that mattered was the operational outcome. Did the Japanese take Port Moresby? They did not. Therefore, they lost. The simplicity of Wilmot's standard, did you achieve your objective or didn't you, cuts through the complexity that Morison's balanced formulation obscures. John Lundstrom's contributions, the first South Pacific campaign in 1976 and the first team in 1984, added another dimension by challenging the tactical defeat characterization from the Allied side. Lundstrom showed that American combat performance at Coral Sea was more competent than Morison had allowed. Fletcher's decisions, often portrayed as hesitant or confused, were based on real intelligence and real logistical constraints. The American air groups, despite fighting with obsolescent torpedo aircraft and imperfect coordination, inflicted damage that removed 2 Japanese fleet carriers from the next month's operations. Lundstrom's work didn't argue that Coral Sea was an Allied tactical victory, but it challenged the assumption that the tactical dimension was clearly in Japan's favor. The Japanese themselves, in their post-war assessments, were notably more critical of their own performance than Morison had been. Several senior officers, including Inoue himself, assessed Coral Sea as a clear failure of the MO plan. The Senshi Sosho's treatment of the battle is measured, but acknowledges the operation's objectives were not achieved. The post-war IJN perspective contradicts the tactical victory, framing by the simple standard of whether the operation accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. It didn't. Japanese officers knew this. The tactical victory label was in some ways an American construction, a way of acknowledging Japanese combat effectiveness while claiming the strategic outcome, creating a narrative arc in which Coral Sea was the setback that made Midway the triumph. I've changed my mind about this battle 3 times during the research for this documentary. I started where most people start, with Morison's tactical defeat, strategic victory. It's comfortable, it's balanced, it acknowledges complexity. Then I moved to Wilmot's framework, operational failure, which has the virtue of clarity and the strength of being anchored to the operation's stated objective. And now I've arrived at something less tidy. I believe the carrier battle was approximately a draw, and the campaign, Operation MO, was a Japanese defeat. I hold this view lightly. The evidence supports multiple interpretations, and I expect historians will be arguing about Coral Sea long after this documentary has been forgotten. There is a structural reason why Morrison's formulation persisted as long as it did, and it has less to do with evidence than with narrative utility. Morrison was writing the official history of U.S. naval operations. His narrative arc required a dramatic structure: setback followed by triumph, darkness before dawn. Coral Sea needed to be a setback, a but, so that Midway could be the triumphant therefore. If Coral Sea were framed as a full Allied victory, the dramatic tension of the Midway narrative would be diminished. The story works better, as a story, if Coral Sea is a costly draw and Midway is the decisive turn. Morrison was a historian, but he was also a storyteller, and the needs of the story shaped his assessment. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about how narrative requirements influence historical judgments, even in the most rigorous hands. The concept of exchange ratio as a measure of battle outcome deserves its own scrutiny. Exchange ratios are borrowed from economics, where they make sense. The relative cost of goods can be compared because goods exist on a common market. But military engagements are not markets. The Japanese were attacking. The Allies were defending. In a defensive engagement, the defender wins by preventing the attack regardless of what it costs. Applying an exchange ratio to Coral Sea is like judging a goalkeeper by how many goals they scored, rather than how many they stopped. Lexington's loss was painful. It was not strategically decisive. Port Moresby's continued possession by the Allies was. The metrics compete with each other, and the choice of which metric to privilege determines the verdict. The debate will continue because the evidence genuinely supports multiple interpretations, and that ambiguity is itself a feature of the battle's historical significance. Coral Sea was the first carrier versus carrier engagement in history. Neither side had a doctrinal framework for assessing the results. Neither side had fought this kind of battle before. The confusion about who won is not a failure of post-war analysis. It reflects the genuine novelty and confusion of the event itself. The participants didn't know who had won. Fletcher wasn't sure. Takagi wasn't sure. Inoue was sure he had failed, but his superiors disagreed. The uncertainty that persists in the historiography mirrors the uncertainty that pervaded the battle itself. The ledger remains open. The tonnage column favors Japan. The operational outcome column favors the Allies. The aircrew column, 90 Japanese versus 35 to 40 American, favors the Allies. The strategic consequence column, 2 Japanese carriers unavailable for Midway, favors the Allies overwhelmingly. Which column you read determines what you conclude, and the choice of column is, in the end, an editorial judgment disguised as an analytical one. Morrison made his choice. Wilmot made his. Lundstrom made his. I've made mine. And the Coral Sea, which doesn't care about historiographical debates, lies flat and blue and deep over the graves of both nations' dead, keeping its own counsel. Chapter 17. The Ghost at Midway. In the Combined Fleet's order of battle for the Midway operation, designated MI, drafted in the weeks following Coral Sea, documented in the Senshi Sosho, and reproduced in Partial and Tully's Shattered Sword, the carrier striking force is listed: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu. 4 fleet carriers, 4 names. But earlier drafts of the plan, as reconstructed by post-war historians from surviving planning documents and staff officer testimonies, included 2 additional names: Shōkaku and Zuikaku. 6 carriers. Someone crossed them out. That crossing out is the Battle of the Coral Sea, rendered in a single editorial stroke on a planning document, and it is the most consequential deletion in the Pacific War. The causal chains from Coral Sea to Midway are specific, traceable, and independent. They don't require speculation or counterfactual reasoning. They require only the operational records. Chain 1. Shōkaku took 3 bomb hits on the 8th of May. Her flight deck was destroyed. She required 90 days of repair at Kure Naval Arsenal. She was physically absent from the Midway operation. This traces directly to the American SBD pilots who scored those 3 hits. Chain 2. Zuikaku's air group, after absorbing Coral Sea losses and consolidating the survivors of both carriers, was assessed as not combat ready. The unit had lost approximately 40% of its experienced aircrew. The reconstituted group lacked cohesion. Zuikaku was declared unavailable for Midway, not for mechanical reasons but for personnel reasons. This traces to the cumulative aircrew losses of the 7th and 8th of May, including the Twilight mission's 9 wasted aircraft. Chain 3, Yorktown. The carrier the Japanese believed they had sunk at Coral Sea was repaired in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor and appeared off Midway on the morning of the 4th of June, with a composite air group and a patched hull. The Japanese did not expect her. Their intelligence assessment, 2 American carriers sunk at Coral Sea, meant they planned for a 4-against-2 engagement. The reality was 4-against-3. Yorktown's presence was a strategic shock that the Japanese plan had no provision for. Her air group would strike the Japanese carrier Hiryu. The ship that was supposed to be dead delivered blows that helped kill the Japanese carrier force. Chain 4, the intelligence overconfidence. Combined Fleet believed, based on the inflated Coral Sea BDA, that the American carrier force was weaker than it actually was. The Midway plans, the loss of even a single Japanese carrier, which happened within the first minutes of the decisive exchange on the 4th of June, shifted the balance irreversibly. The intelligence error born at Coral Sea detonated at Midway. Had Shōkaku and Zuikaku been present at Midway, the Japanese carrier striking force would have fielded 6 fleet carriers with a combined displacement of approximately 193,600 tons and an air group of over 350 aircraft. Against this, the Americans would have fielded 3 carriers, displacing approximately 67,700 tons with roughly 230 aircraft. 6 against 3. The actual ratio at Midway, 4 Japanese carriers versus 3 American, was closer, tighter, more vulnerable to the kind of sudden reversal that carrier warfare produces. Coral Sea removed approximately 64,200 tons of Japanese carrier capability, 32.9% of what would have been available, from the Midway equation. Whether that margin was the difference between Japanese victory and Japanese defeat is, strictly speaking, unknowable. But it is the margin within which the outcome was decided. The absence of Carrier Division 5 at Midway had tactical consequences beyond the raw reduction in air strength. With 6 carriers, Nagumo could have dedicated 1 carrier's aircraft entirely to search missions, while maintaining 5 carriers' worth of offensive strike power. The search-strike trade-off, the need to balance reconnaissance against attack capability, would have been less painful. With 4 carriers, every aircraft allocated to search was an aircraft subtracted from the strike. Nagumo's decision to use a thin, single-phase search line on the morning of the 4th of June, a decision that delayed his discovery of the American carrier force and contributed directly to the catastrophe that followed, was partly a consequence of needing every available aircraft for his strike on Midway Island, and for the anticipated engagement with the American fleet. More carriers would have meant more search aircraft without reducing strike power. The Coral Sea's aircrew attrition reached into Midway's search doctrine. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, the 4 Japanese carriers launched their strikes and their searches into a clear Pacific sky. They didn't know Yorktown was there. They didn't know their 4-against-2 assumption was wrong. They didn't know that the margin they had counted on, the margin that Coral Sea had quietly erased, no longer existed. Within 6 hours, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning. Hiryu followed that afternoon. 4 fleet carriers, the core of the Kido Butai, gone. The Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific was broken on a single day, and the fracture lines had been drawn 4 weeks earlier, in the Coral Sea, by 3 bomb hits on Shōkaku's flight deck, by 9 aircraft lost in a twilight gamble, by 90 aircrew who died or disappeared, and by an intelligence assessment that recorded certainty where doubt was warranted. I want to close with something I believe but cannot prove with documentary evidence. I believe that if Shōkaku and Zuikaku had been at Midway with full, experienced air groups, the battle would have gone differently. Not certainly a Japanese victory. The Americans had intelligence advantages at Midway that transcended force ratios, and the code breaking that positioned the American carriers in ambush was a factor that no number of additional Japanese carriers could neutralize. But the catastrophic, one-sided nature of the Japanese defeat 4 carriers lost for 1, might not have occurred with 6 carriers in the Japanese force. The margin for error would have been wider. The search capability would have been better. The sheer volume of defensive fighters and anti-aircraft fire would have been greater. The Coral Sea. This indecisive battle, this draw, this footnote before Midway, was the margin. And margins are where history bends. There is a detail from the Senshi Sosho that I think about often. Zuikaku's captain, Takeo Kaizuka, reportedly requested permission to join the Midway operation even without a full air group. He offered to serve in a reduced capacity, as a floating platform for recovering damaged aircraft, as a scout force flagship, as anything that would put his ship in the fight. The request was denied. Kaizuka's frustration, preserved in the spare language of the official history, suggests that at least some Japanese officers understood the cost of Carrier Division 5's absence. They understood that Coral Sea had subtracted something from the force that Midway would need. They understood that the assessment of Coral Sea as a victory was not universally shared within the fleet. But understanding, without the authority to act on it, changes nothing. Zuikaku stayed behind. Midway was fought without her, and the 4 carriers that went in her place did not come back. The Coral Sea is quiet now. It lies between Australia and the Solomon Islands, blue and deep and warm, trafficked by commercial shipping and cruise liners and the occasional naval vessel on an exercise or a transit. The wrecks of Lexington, Neosho, Sims, and Shōhō lie on the bottom, scattered across hundreds of miles of seabed at depths that only specialized research vessels can reach. Lexington was located in 2018 by an expedition led by Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel, resting upright at a depth of approximately 3,000 meters, her aircraft still visible in her hangar bays. The sea preserves what the surface forgets, and the battle that was fought there, the first carrier battle, the battle that nobody won and everybody lost something in, the battle that bent the arc of the Pacific War before anyone fully understood what it meant, lies in the archives and the official histories and the margins of diary entries and the penciled question marks on carbon-copied decrypt sheets, waiting to be read again by someone willing to sit with the evidence and let the numbers speak and the silence accumulate and the question, who won, remain, as it should, not quite answered.